See, he slammed the documents down so hard the ink jar rattled off the edge of the table and shattered on the floor. See, Mara didn't flinch. She had stopped flinching weeks ago. See, you have until Friday, Creditor Hollis said, straightening his coat like he hadn't just destroyed the last thing her husband left behind. See, after that, I take the furniture, I take the linens. See, I take whatever sorry scraps are left in this room, and you go with nothing. See, he didn't even look at her when he said it, just picked up his hat, pressed it onto his head, and walked out like she was already gone. See, maybe she was. If you've ever stood in a room that used to be your life and watched a stranger walk through it, deciding what it was worth this story is for you. See, and if you've never been that desperate, stay with me anyway, because what happened next will change the way you see strength, survival, and what it really means to choose someone. See, before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications because we release stories like this every week, and you do not want to miss what's coming. See, drop a like if you're already feeling this one, and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. See, now let's go back to Red Hollow, Colorado, 1887, and the winter that changed everything. See, the boarding house on Crane Street smelled like lye soap and boiled cabbage, and the particular hopelessness of people who had nowhere better to be. See, Mara Whitlock had been scrubbing its floors for 11 weeks. See, she was 27 years old. She had married at 19, buried her husband at 26, and inherited nothing from that marriage except a stack of debts tall enough to block out the sun. See, Thomas Whitlock had been a charming man, an optimistic man, the kind of man who believed the next venture would be the one that worked, right up until the last one didn't. See, by the time he died of fever in the summer of 1886, he owed money to 6 different men in 2 different counties, and every single one of them knew where his widow lived. See, she had sold the house first, then the furniture, then her mother's silver hairbrush, which she'd cried over for 3 days before accepting she had no other choice. See, now she scrubbed floors for a woman named Dottie Crail, who paid fair wages and asked no questions, which was more than most employers in Red Hollow were willing to offer a widow without references. See, Mara was not the kind of woman who complained about hard work. See, she'd grown up watching her mother work harder than any man she knew, and she'd absorbed that without bitterness work was just work, and self-pity was a luxury that didn't pay rent. See, what she couldn't absorb, what sat in her chest like a stone she couldn't dislodge, was the specific humiliation of being seen as nothing. See, of walking through Red Hollow and watching people calculate her situation in one glance and look away. See, she was a woman without a man, without money, without leverage. See, in 1887, that was as close to invisible as a person could get. See, she was on her knees in the back hallway 3rd time that week because one of the permanent boarders had a dog that apparently treated the floor as a personal convenience when she heard the front door open and felt the cold roll in like a wall. See, she didn't look up immediately. She had learned to finish what she was doing before she looked up, because interrupting a job halfway was how you ended up doing it twice. See, I'm looking for a woman named Mara Whitlock. The voice was low. See, not a town voice, not the clipped, slightly theatrical tone of men who spent their time in offices and courtrooms. See, this voice had the particular flatness of someone who spent most of their time outdoors and saw no reason to dress words up. See, she sat back on her heels and looked. The man in the doorway was enormous. See, not fat enormous, 6 feet and several inches of solid, weathered mass, wearing a coat that had clearly been made to fit him and still looked like it was struggling with the assignment. See, his face was the color of someone who spent every season outside, dark from wind and sun and cold, framed by jaw-length dark hair that hadn't been cut with any great ambition. See, he had a beard that needed work, eyes that were an indeterminate dark color, and an expression that said he would rather be somewhere else. See, most men who walked into a boarding house looking for a woman did so with a particular energy expectation, hunger, entitlement, some combination of all 3. See, this man looked like he was here to solve a problem he hadn't fully accepted was his. See, Mara stood up slowly, because her knees ached and she wasn't 20 anymore, and said, "That's me." See, he looked at her, not the way men usually looked at her, not assessing, not dismissive, not with the particular pity she'd grown to hate. See, he looked at her the way a man looks at something he's trying to figure out. See, "I'm Ronan Mercer," he said. "I have land in the Blackstone Range." See, "About 3,000 acres. "I don't know what that has to do with me," Mara said, which was true, and also the only thing she could think to say. "See, I need a wife," he said. "Temporary. Until spring." See, the silence that followed was the kind that happens when the room hasn't caught up with what was just said. See, Mara's first coherent thought was that she should ask him to leave. See, her second thought, which arrived immediately behind the first, crowding it out, was that she had $14 to her name, 3 creditors who would be back before the month ended, see, and no visible future beyond the board she was currently kneeling to clean. See, she did not ask him to leave. "Explain that," she said instead. See, Ronan Mercer stepped inside and let the door fall shut behind him, and for a moment she had the uncomfortable sensation of watching something large and wild move into a space that was too small to contain it properly. See, he explained it the way he'd apparently decided to explain everything, without decoration, without softness, without any apparent concern for how it sounded. See, his father had died the previous year. His father had been a particular kind of man, the kind who believed in controlling people even after he was gone, and his will contained a single brutal condition. See, the Mercer land in Blackstone Valley, all 3,000 acres of it, would pass to Ronan on one condition and one condition only, that Ronan be legally married and maintaining a legitimate household by the first day of spring, 1887. See, if he wasn't, the land reverted to whatever the court decided, and the court, in this county, had a cozy relationship with the Western Meridian Railway Company, which had wanted that land for 2 years. See, so the railway gets it if you're not married, Mara said. See, yes. How do they verify it's legitimate? A magistrate comes in spring to inspect the homestead. See, we have to demonstrate a shared household, real one, not improvised. See, and you're asking me because I need someone who can actually run a household for 4 months, not someone who'll fall apart in the first hard storm. See, I asked around. Dottie Crale said you were the best worker she'd seen in years, and you don't make a fuss. He paused. See, I'm offering $1,000. Mara went very still. See, $1,000 was 2 years of floor scrubbing. See, it was the complete elimination of Thomas's debts, with enough left to put herself somewhere better than Red Hollow. See, it was the difference between surviving and actually living. See, she looked at him for a long moment and thought about the kind of man who walks into a boarding house with an offer like this. See, she'd known men who made propositions to women in difficult circumstances, and they all had a certain quality, a readiness to collect, an assumption that desperation was a door left unlocked. See, Ronan Mercer didn't have that quality. He had the specific, uncomfortable quality of a man who had exhausted every other option and arrived at this one reluctantly, and was not enjoying it. See, what are the conditions, she asked. Separate beds. See, separate lives. No touching. No, he seemed to search for the right word. See, no confusion about what this is. We run the house. We present ourselves to the magistrate in spring. You take your money and go. See, that's all. That's all, she repeated. See, I don't want a wife, he said. See, and he said it without cruelty. See, which somehow made it sharper. See, I want my land back. You need money. It's a transaction. See, Mara had spent 11 weeks on her knees in this hallway. See, she thought about creditor Hollis and his hat and the way he'd walked out like she was furniture. See, she thought about the $14 in her shoe. See, she thought about her mother who had worked her whole life and died with nothing, and whether there was something inherited and inescapable in that outcome, or whether a person could make a different choice if a different choice presented itself. See, I'll need the first half up front, she said. $500 before we leave town. See, something moved behind his eyes. Not irritation, more like the recognition of someone who knows how to negotiate. See, $300 up front, he said. The rest in spring. See, $400, she said, and I want it in writing. See, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, fine. She put out her hand. See, he shook it. His hand was enormous and calloused and warm, and she noted, with the practical part of her mind, that he had a grip that could crack wood if he wanted to, and was choosing not to. See, we leave Thursday, he said. Pack for 4 months of cold. See, I know how to pack, she said. He nodded once sharp, settled, and turned toward the door. See. Then he stopped with his hand on the frame and said, without turning around, I'm going to tell you something, Mrs. See, Whitlock, because I'd rather you know it going in than figure it out later and feel cheated. See, she waited. The cabin is small, he said. The winter up there is serious. See, it will get harder than you think, and there won't be anywhere to go. See, I am not a gentleman and I am not good company. I need the land. See, I don't need anything else. He paused. As long as we're both clear on that, we'll manage fine. See. He walked out. Mara stood in the hallway for a moment, her hands still damp from the scrub water, listening to the door settle in its frame. See. Then she went to find Dottie Crail and give her notice. See. The wagon ride to Blackstone Valley took 2 days and felt like 3. See. Ronan drove and spoke approximately 11 words total, which Mara counted, not because she was keeping score, but because silence of that particular quality demanded categorization. See, she had expected awkward. She had not expected this, the absolute architectural silence of a man who genuinely did not feel the need to fill space with sound. See, most people, alone with a stranger for hours, eventually talked. See, about the weather, about the road, about something. See, Ronan Mercer apparently found conversation no more necessary than a third wheel on a wagon. See, Mara used the silence to watch the landscape change, which it did with increasing drama as they climbed. See, Red Hollow was already high country, already cold, but the Blackstone Range was something different. See, the trees became denser and then taller, the road became a track and then a suggestion, and by the second afternoon, the world was white and gray, and the specific deep quiet of a place that hadn't heard a voice in months. See, the cabin appeared around a bend in the tree line, and her first thought, which she kept behind her teeth, was that it was smaller than she'd expected. See, it was solid. Ronan had built it himself. She would learn later, over 2 summers, and it had a stone chimney and an actual wooden floor and a window with real glass, which was more than she'd feared. See, but it was one room, divided by function rather than walls. See, a sleeping area with 2 rope beds on opposite sides. See, a cooking area with a stove and a workbench, a rough table with 2 chairs. See, shelves along one wall stacked with supplies. Ronan set her trunk inside, picked up a piece of firewood from the stack by the door, and drew a line across the floor from the stove to the far wall. See, she stared at it. Your side, he said, pointing to the left. See, my side. The line doesn't move. Mara looked at the line, then at him, then at the line again. See, that's the most theatrical thing I've seen a grown man do, she said. See, he didn't smile, but something at the edge of his expression shifted just slightly in a way she couldn't name. See, we understand each other, he said. Perfectly, she said. See, she put her bag down on her side of the line, sat on the edge of the rope bed, and looked at the ceiling. See, outside, the wind was picking up. Inside, the man on the other side of a scraped line in the floorboards was building a fire like she wasn't there. See, Mara had made bargains before. She had made them with creditors and landlords and employers, and she had always understood the terms going in. See, this was no different. This was a transaction, as the man himself had said. See, 4 months, $500 more. A magistrate in spring. See, done, she told herself that. See, then she pulled her coat tighter and watched the fire catch, and listened to the wind find the gaps in the logs, and tried to remember the last time anyone had bothered to tell her, going in, exactly what they didn't want from her. See, it was the most honest she'd been offered in years. See, she wasn't sure yet whether that made it better or worse. See, outside, the first real snow of the season had begun to fall, steady and indifferent, burying the track they'd come in on. See, by morning it would be gone. By morning, there would be no road back. See, only the mountain and the man and the line on the floor and 4 months of winter waiting to find out which one of them would break first. See, the line on the floor lasted exactly 9 days before it became a joke neither of them acknowledged out loud. See, not because either of them crossed it. Ronan didn't cross it, and Mara didn't cross it, and both of them were careful in the specific way people are careful when they're pretending not to notice something. See, but the line had been drawn with the heel of a boot on a wooden floor, and wood breathes and settles in the cold, and by the end of the first week it had faded to a suggestion. See, and by the end of the second it was gone entirely, and neither of them said a word about it. See, which was, Mara thought, either very mature or a very bad sign. See, the first week had been the hardest in ways she hadn't expected. See, she'd prepared herself for cold, for isolation, for discomfort. See, she had not prepared herself for the specific difficulty of sharing a small space with a person who treated silence like a physical structure he'd built around himself and intended to maintain. See, Ronan Mercer woke before dawn, dressed without a sound, and was out the door before she'd fully surfaced from sleep. See, he came back at dusk, sometimes earlier if the weather turned, said whatever was functionally necessary brought venison, or winds picking up from the north, and spent the evening doing exactly what he'd done every other evening. See, sharpening tools, checking traps, by firelight, reading from a single battered book he never offered to share. See, she had tried in the first few days to make conversation. See, not because she particularly needed it. Mara had spent enough time alone to be comfortable without talk, but because the silence between strangers had a different texture than the silence between people who knew each other. See, and she hadn't yet figured out how to be comfortable inside it. See, how long have you been up here? She'd asked on the second night. See, 7 years, he said, without looking up from whatever he was mending. See, alone the whole time, mostly. Doesn't it get... She stopped herself from saying lonely because it was too pointed. See, quiet. He looked up then, briefly. Yes, he said, and went back to his work in a way that made clear he didn't consider that a problem worth solving. See, she gave up on conversation after that. What she did instead was work, because work was the one language she knew was universal. See, the cabin, for all its solid construction, had been maintained by a solitary man with no interest in comfort, which meant it was functional in the way a tool is functional. It did what it needed to do and nothing more. See, no real organization. Supplies stacked wherever they'd been put down and never moved. See, a stove that worked, but had a particular quirk with its damper that made it smoke if you didn't know the trick. See, bedding that was clean but rough. The kind of clean that comes from a man who washes things because they need washing, not because there's any satisfaction in it. See, Mara reorganized the shelves on the third day. See, not because Ronan had asked her to, he hadn't asked her to do anything, had in fact seemed mildly surprised every morning to find breakfast waiting, but because she couldn't function in a space she didn't understand. See, and understanding a space meant putting it in order. See, she found, behind a crate of dry beans, a tin box. See, she almost opened it. Her hand was on the lid before something stopped her, not a rule. Exactly, just the instinct that some things in a solitary man's home were private in ways that outweighed curiosity. See, she put it back where she found it and didn't mention it. See, but she thought about it. By the end of the second week, they had settled into something that wasn't friendship and wasn't quite the cold transaction Ronan had described, but existed somewhere in the uncomfortable territory between. See, a routine careful and unspoken. She cooked, he brought the meat and cut the wood. See, she kept the stove managed. He handled the outside work and checked the perimeter and came home smelling of cold air and pine, and occasionally blood from whatever he'd been cleaning out on the trap lines. See, she repaired his coat on the 11th day. She hadn't planned to. See, she'd found it hanging by the door, with a torn seam along the left shoulder, not a small tear, the kind of structural damage that would let the cold in, and she'd sat down with her needle and thread and fixed it without thinking much about it. See, when he came in that evening and reached for the coat, he stopped with his hand on it and looked at the seam. See, he didn't say thank you. What he said was, "You didn't have to do that." See, "I know," she said. He put the coat on and went out to bring in more wood, and when he came back, he set the extra pieces closer to her side of the stove than his own, which was the closest thing to a concession she'd seen him make. See, she filed that away and said nothing. The cold was serious in a way that the town cold never was. See, Red Hollow got cold enough to freeze water in a basin overnight, cold enough that you didn't linger outside without a reason. See, But Blackstone Valley cold had a different quality, a density, and a persistence that felt less like weather and more like something the mountain was doing on purpose. See, it didn't vary much. It didn't warm in the afternoons the way lower altitude cold did. See, it simply settled in and stayed, and you adjusted to it or you suffered. And either way, it didn't care. See, Mara adjusted. She'd always been better at adjusting than she'd given herself credit for. See, Thomas used to say she had a talent for making the best of things, and he'd meant it as a compliment. See, though sometimes it had felt like he was describing a trait that made it easier for him to keep making bad decisions, she would adjust to those too. And she had, right up until there was nothing left to adjust to. See, she thought about Thomas less up here than she'd expected. See, she wasn't sure whether that was healthy or not. She decided it didn't matter either way. See, on the 15th night, she woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of Ronan moving around on his side of the room and made the mistake of asking, in the fog of half-sleep, if something was wrong. See, bad dream, he said. See, flat and immediate. See, like he'd had the answer ready. See, she almost left it there. Instead, she said, "You get them a lot?" See, a pause that lasted long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. See, sometimes, he said. "Me too," she said. Another pause. See, "Go back to sleep," he said. But it was the gentlest thing he'd said to her since they'd arrived, and she turned toward the wall and closed her eyes and thought that there were different ways of knowing a person, and this was apparently one of them. See, by the end of the 3rd week, a pattern had settled that surprised her with its functionality. See, what she had not anticipated was competence. See, she'd walked in expecting to manage a difficult situation alongside a difficult man, and she'd steeled herself for that. But what she hadn't prepared for was how good Ronan Mercer was at the actual business of staying alive. See, he was not reckless. He was not careless. See, he moved through the mountain with a certainty that came from years of reading. Yet he knew where the snow would drift, and where the ice formed soonest, and which direction the worst winds came from, and how to read the sky 2 days out. See, he made no wasted movements, and took no unnecessary risks. And watching him work had a particular quality that she couldn't quite name for the first week, and then finally identified. He was competent the way a craftsman is competent. See, not because he was trying to impress anyone, but because he'd simply done this long enough that excellence was the default. See, she respected that, more than she expected to. She thought, occasionally, that he might be watching her too, making the same kind of assessment, but it was hard to tell because Ronan Mercer's face gave very little away. See, she caught him looking once, early in the 3rd week, when she was rendering fat by the stove and didn't realize immediately that he was in the doorway. See, he looked away before she could be sure what the expression meant. See, the food was the first real crack in the arrangement. See, not a fight. She wasn't sure the two of them were capable of a conventional fight. They didn't have the vocabulary for each other to reach that register. See, but there was a moment toward the end of the 4th week when she set a plate in front of him that contained the larger portion of venison. See, because she'd noticed over the previous weeks that she wasn't eating as much as he was burning, and it seemed only fair, and he pushed it back toward her. See, "That's yours," she said. "You take the bigger piece," he said. "See, I gave you the bigger piece on purpose." "I know." "See, take it back." She stared at him. "You need more food than I do." "See, you're outside all day." "I've been managing my food intake for 34 years without help," he said, which wasn't exactly hostile but had an edge that told her she'd accidentally stepped on something. See, she took the bigger piece back. She did not apologize, because she hadn't done anything wrong, and they both knew it. See, 2 days later she found, on the workbench where she usually set out the day's provisions, an extra portion of dried fruit she hadn't rationed out for herself. See, it was just sitting there. Ronan was already outside. See, she ate it without comment. He never mentioned it either. See, she was beginning to understand how Ronan Mercer communicated. See, not in words were for the functional minimum, for information transfer, for things that couldn't be managed any other way. See, he communicated in actions, in the small and deniable gestures of a man who had spent so long alone that the language of human exchange had atrophied in him, but the impulse behind it hadn't. See, she found that more interesting than she wanted to. See, The book was a history of the Roman Empire. She found this out on the night he set it down, and she happened to be close enough to read the spine. See, she had read it herself, years ago had read it, and found it magnificent and terrible in equal measure, the way all histories of things that fall apart tend to be. See, have you read it before? She asked. 3 times, he said. See. Why? He considered this, which was unusual. He generally didn't consider her questions, just answered them, or didn't. See, because it doesn't lie, he said finally. Most books lie. See, this one just tells you what happened and lets you decide how you feel about it. See, she looked at him for a moment. I read it when I was 20, she said. See, I cried at the end. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. See, then he said, which part? The last emperor, she said. See, he just carried on, as long as he could, even after it was already over. See, he was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said. It was the most they'd talked since the wagon ride, and neither of them acknowledged it afterward, and the next morning he was out the door before dawn, the same as always. See, but that evening he left the book on the workbench in a position that was just slightly too convenient, too available, and she picked it up and read for an hour before bed, and when she set it back down, she put it in the same position he'd left it. See, the first serious test came in the 5th week. She'd been wrong earlier, thinking the cold was already as bad as it got. See, the cold in the 5th week was a different category of experience entirely. See, it came from the north with a meanness that felt personal, dropping the temperature so far below anything she'd previously called cold that her frame of reference stopped working. See, the stove ran almost continuously, the window glazed over on the inside. See, she slept with everything she owned piled on top of her and still woke at 3 in the morning with her feet numb. See, Ronan cut wood for 6 hours straight one afternoon and came in looking like something the storm had chewed on and spat out covered in ice crystals, so cold his beard had frozen in places. See, moving with the deliberate stiffness of a man maintaining function through sheer will. See, she had a bowl of broth waiting without having thought about why. See, he sat down and wrapped his hands around it, and she watched the stiffness ease out of him degree by degree, and did not say anything about how foolish it was to be out that long and that cold. See, because he clearly knew more about what this mountain required than she did, and she was not his mother. See, thank you, he said, which were 2 words she hadn't heard from him yet. See, you cut the wood, she said. See, he looked at her over the bowl with those dark, unreadable eyes, and she had the strange and inconvenient sensation of being seen, not assessed, not categorized, but actually seen in the way that doesn't happen often and is difficult to explain. See, she looked away first. She wasn't sure what to do with that. See, then the blizzard came. Not the cold they'd been managing that was just winter. See, this was something else. It arrived in the early morning of the 41st day, announced by a change in the wind that Ronan had apparently heard in his sleep. See, because she woke to find him already dressed and moving with a focused efficiency that told her this was serious before he said a word. See, storm's coming, he said. Bad one. I need to check the animal shelter and bring in enough wood to last 3, maybe 4 days. See, you need to check every seam on the window and door. There's extra cloth in the bottom of the supply crate. See, use it all. How long before it hits? He looked at the window. See, outside, the sky had the particular greenish gray of something she didn't have words for. See, 3 hours. Maybe 2. She didn't ask more questions. See, she found the cloth and started on the window while he went out, and for 2 hours they worked in parallel, her inside sealing gaps and double-checking the stove's fuel supply, him outside doing things she could hear but not see. See, he made 4 trips in that time, each one coming in with an armload of wood or supplies, face tighter each time against the incoming cold. See, he was on his 5th trip out when she heard the wind shift. See, she knew it was bad from the sound alone. It wasn't a gust, it was a sustained, screaming wall of pressure that hit the cabin like something that wanted in. See, the window shuddered, the door rattled in its frame. See, the stove belched smoke, and she adjusted the damper fast, the trick she'd learned in the first week, and managed it, but her heart was hitting her ribs harder than she wanted to admit. See, she waited for Ronan to come back. 5 minutes. 10. See, She went to the door and opened it an inch, and the cold hit her like a fist, and she could see nothing, absolutely nothing, beyond the reach of the lantern light, just white and motion, and the howling that had swallowed every other sound. 15 minutes. She put on everything she had, her coat, his spare coat that was so large on her it was almost comical, her scarf, her heaviest gloves, and cracked the door again. Ronan. The wind ate her voice before it traveled 2 feet. 20 minutes. She went out. She stayed close to the cabin wall because that was the only navigation she had, feeling her way along the logs with one hand while the wind tried to peel her off the mountain. She found the corner, turned it, kept going. The animal shelter was maybe 30 feet from the cabin's north face, and she knew the direction, more or less, and she was counting steps and thinking very clearly about everything she was going to say to him if he was standing there fine, and she'd walked into a blizzard for nothing. She found him 10 steps from the shelter door. He was on one knee in the snow, one hand pressed to his left side, and the snow around him was not entirely white. She got under his arm without discussion, and he said, through his teeth, "Don't," and she shut up, which was also without discussion. And between them they covered the 30 feet back to the cabin in a manner that could not have looked graceful to anyone watching, but got the job done. Inside, she got the door shut against the wind by putting her entire back against it, and then she turned and looked at Ronan Mercer in the full light of the lantern, and her stomach dropped. He'd caught his side on something, a broken tool, a protruding nail. She didn't know yet, and it didn't matter right now. And the wound along his ribs was deep and had been bleeding long enough that his shirt was soaked through, and the cold had started to slow the blood but hadn't stopped it. It's not sit down. He sat. She had seen wounds before. Her father had been a farmer, and farmers accumulated damage the way barns accumulated weather, and she'd helped her mother clean and close more injuries than she could count. She'd been afraid of blood as a girl and had gotten over it somewhere around age 12 out of necessity, and she was grateful for that now in a distant, functional way while she worked. He didn't make a sound while she cleaned it, not one. She was not gentle, she couldn't afford to be gentle, she had to be thorough, and he sat with his hands flat on his knees and his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on the middle distance and didn't flinch once. She thought, working, that this was the most she'd touched him in 6 weeks. The most either of them had crossed the invisible space between their respective halves of the arrangement. She was aware of it, and she put the awareness aside, because there was a wound to close and a storm trying to get into the cabin, and this was not the moment for complicated feelings. Hold this, she said, pressing a cloth to his side. He put his hand over hers. Just for a second, just the time it took to transfer pressure, his hand was over hers, and she felt the warmth of it through her glove, and then he moved, and she was binding the wound, and the moment passed the way moments do when you're busy. She got him into his bed without discussion. He was running a low fever by midnight, which she'd half expected. She'd put everything she had in the way of preventive measures into the wound before closing it, but she was working with the supplies of a mountain trapper, not a doctor, and a wound that sits open in winter cold is a wound that fights back. She sat in the chair between their beds and fed the stove through the night and watched him for changes in the fever, the way her mother had taught her. And the blizzard shook the cabin walls, and the wind found the gaps she hadn't sealed, and she sealed them again with rags, moving back and forth, and around 3 a.m, Ronan opened his eyes and looked at her. You should sleep, he said. His voice was rougher than usual, scraped by fever and cold. I know, she said. Go to bed, Mara. It was the first time he'd used her name. Just her name. No title, no formality, just Mara. Like it was the natural thing. She didn't point that out. I will when the fever breaks, she said. He looked at her for a moment with those dark eyes that the fever had made slightly too bright, and she could not read his expression entirely. But she thought there was something in it that was less guarded than his usual register. Less defended. You went out into the blizzard, he said. Yes, that was effective, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, exactly. Something that acknowledged one was possible. Effective, he repeated. She refilled the bowl of water she'd been using to manage his temperature and went back to the stove, and he was asleep again before she'd sat back down, and the storm howled and the cabin held. And Mara Whitlock sat between a sick man's bed and a burning stove and thought about the strange mathematics of obligation, how you could start with a transaction and end up somewhere else entirely without ever deciding to move. The fever broke before dawn on the second day. She knew it had broken when he stopped moving in his sleep, and the restless, burning quality went out of him, and he sank into something deeper and more quiet, and she let herself sleep in the chair for 3 hours. Which was the first sleep she'd gotten in 36 hours. And when she woke, her neck ached badly, and the stove needed feeding, and Ronan was lying on his back, looking at the ceiling with an expression she couldn't see fully from her angle. She got up and fed the stove. "How bad?" he asked. "You'll be stiff for a week," she said, "and you need to keep it clean. I'll need to change the dressing twice a day for at least 10 days. He said nothing to this. "I found the iodine in your supply crate," she said. "You're lucky you had it." "I know what I packed," he said. There it was, the edge again, the slight bristle of a man not accustomed to being managed. She looked at him steadily. "I'm not telling you what you packed," she said. "I'm telling you that you had what we needed, and that was luck, because the alternative would have been unpleasant for both of us." He looked at her, then looked at the ceiling again. "Thank you," he said. Slower this time, more deliberate, like he was placing each word with care. For going out. And for he stopped. Started again. You didn't have to sit up through the night." "No," she agreed. "Why did you?" She looked at him for a moment. "Because you were hurt, and it was cold, and someone needed to," she said. There doesn't have to be a better reason than that. He was quiet for a long time after that. Long enough that she thought the conversation was over and moved to start the day's provisions. "Mara." She turned. He was looking at her directly, which he didn't do. Often, usually his eyes were on the work, on the door, on whatever task was in front of him. Looking at her directly had a different quality, more weight, and she noticed it even as she registered that noticing it was probably a problem. "The arrangement," he said. "The terms." "Yes." "They haven't changed," he said. And then, before she could respond, "I need you to know that." She looked at him for a moment. "Of course," she said. She turned back to the provisions. Behind her, she heard him exhale, slow, long, like something released, and she kept her face toward the stove, and kept her expression level, and thought about all the ways a man can remind himself of something he wants to believe. The storm cleared on the third day. The world outside was transformed, buried and white and silent, in a way that made the violence of the previous 3 days almost impossible to believe. The light hit the snow with a sharpness that made her eyes water when she opened the door, and the cold was extreme but still. The kind of still that comes after a storm has spent itself completely. She stood in the doorway and breathed it in and thought, 4 months. They were 6 weeks in. Behind her, Ronan was moving carefully around his side of the cabin, testing his range of motion in the specific way of a man who knows his body well enough to assess damage without much commentary. She heard him stop, heard him pick something up. She already knew what it was. She could feel it before she turned the particular charge of a decision being made. She turned anyway. He was standing in the middle of the room, equidistant between both beds, holding the history book. He held it out to her. Not placed on the workbench. Not left convenient. Held out directly across the space between them. "You haven't finished it," he said. She crossed the room and took it from his hand, and their fingers didn't touch, not quite, but it was close enough that the air between them had a temperature. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and went to sit carefully at the table, and she went to her side and opened the book, and neither of them said anything else. And outside, the mountain gleamed white and terrible in the cold morning light. And somewhere beneath the transaction and the rules and the line that wasn't on the floor anymore, something was shifting in ways that neither of them had agreed to, and neither of them, not yet, were willing to name. The book became a quiet conversation between them that neither acknowledged directly. She would read a section, leave it on the workbench in the morning, and find it moved sometimes back to his side, sometimes left where it was with a strip of rawhide marking a different page than where she'd stopped. See, the first time she found it marked ahead of where she'd been, she opened to the page and read it, and understood he was pointing at something. See, the passage was about a general who'd held a border for 11 years because no one had told him the war was over, and he'd kept his men alive through discipline and routine and the sheer refusal to let circumstances become an excuse for failure. See, she read it twice. Then she put the strip of rawhide back and left it on his side. See, that evening he looked at her across the table and she looked back, and neither of them said anything about it, but something had been communicated nonetheless. See, and the strange and slightly uncomfortable thing was that she didn't know which of them had sent the message and which had received it. See, she thought about that for several nights. The wound healed the way wounds do when the person attached to them is in excellent health and refuses to accommodate inconvenience faster than she'd expected, slower than he wanted. See, she changed the dressing twice a day, as she'd said she would, and he tolerated this with a tightness around his jaw that told her it hurt more than he was willing to say. See, and she worked as efficiently as she could because she understood that the act of being tended to was more uncomfortable for him than the wound itself. See, on the 6th day of dressing changes, she finished and started to step back, and he said, without looking at her, "You have steady hands." See, "My mother did this," she said. "I learned early." See, she a doctor's wife, farmer's wife. Farmers get hurt constantly. She was folding the unused cloth as she spoke, not looking at him either. See, she used to say that the best thing you could learn in life was how to fix things, because everything breaks eventually. See, he was quiet. "She sounds practical," he said. "She was the most practical person I've ever known." A pause. See, "She died when I was 22. I miss her more as I get older, which I didn't expect." See, she hadn't planned to say that. It came out without permission, the way things sometimes do when you're doing something with your hands and your guard is in a different room. See, he didn't say he was sorry. She was grateful for that. She'd had years of people saying they were sorry, and it never helped. It just forced her to reassure them that she was fine. See, what Ronan said was, "What was her name?" "Clara," she said. See, Clara Holt, before she married. He nodded once, like he was filing it somewhere. See, she went back to the stove. But for the rest of that day, she had the odd, slightly disorienting feeling of having said a true thing to someone who listened to it, and she didn't know what to do with that. See, the recovery chafed him badly. She could see it, the enforced stillness, the reliance on her for things he would normally have handled himself, the particular misery of a highly capable person confined to partial function. See, he was not a complainer, but he was also not a stoic in the way she'd initially assumed. See, he was more honest than stoic. He simply didn't editorialize about difficulty. He felt it clearly, and he dealt with it, and he didn't perform either the suffering or the overcoming of it. See, but she could read the frustration in the set of his shoulders, in the way he'd pick up a tool and put it back down because bending that far pulled on the wound, in the evenings when he sat too still for a man who was usually in motion. See, she started giving him tasks. Not as a kindness, exactly, or not only as a kindness. See, she was smart enough to know that what Ronan Mercer needed was not to be managed, but to be useful, and there were things she genuinely needed done that could be done sitting down. See, mending, checking the supply inventory against her rationing calculations, which she'd been doing in her head, but having them on paper would be better. See, sharpening the kitchen knives, which she didn't have the right tool for, but he did. See, he didn't say thank you, but he did the tasks, and he did them with the focused attention he apparently brought to everything, and the mending he returned to her was better than anything she'd managed herself. See, "You're good at this," she said, looking at the stitching on a torn sleeve. See, "Spent 7 years fixing my own things," he said. See, "You learn or you suffer. Your father didn't teach you." See, the quality of the silence changed, not dramatically, but enough. See, "No," he said. She didn't push. She'd learned the map of what could be touched and what couldn't, more or less, and she filed that territory as somewhere she didn't have enough information to navigate safely. See, 2 days later he volunteered, with no preceding context. "My father wasn't a man who taught things." See, he gave orders, did it his whole life. Even the will was just another order. See, she was at the stove and kept her eyes on what she was doing. See, is that why you're up here? She said, away from orders. See, another silence, different from the last. Partly, he said. See, she waited. I was in the army, he said, before this. See, 4 years. He stopped there, like he was deciding something. See, I got good at following orders, and I got good at giving them, and I decided I was done with both. See, and the land? The land doesn't ask anything of me, he said. See, it just is. You read it right, treat it right, and it gives back. See, you don't, he stopped. Started differently. There's no negotiating with it. See, no hidden conditions. What you see is what it is. See, she turned then and looked at him, because there was something in that particular speech that meant more than the words. See, he was looking at his hands. Your father was full of hidden conditions, she said. See, he looked up at her. Yes, he said, and then flatly, so was my wife. See, the word landed in the room with a weight she hadn't expected. See, she waited. 11 years ago, he said. She left in the second winter. See, said I was gone too much, in my head too much. Not, he moved his jaw slightly, like he was chewing on the right word and finding it difficult. See, she said she felt like she was living alone even when I was there. See, Mara thought about this. She thought about whether to say what she was thinking, and then she said it. See, were you? He looked at her. Were you gone too much? She said. See, in your head. Probably, he said. See, he didn't say it like it was an excuse. He said it like it was just true, and he'd had a long time to arrive at accurate. See, I'm not good at, he stopped again, made a short, restless movement with his hand. See, I know that. I know what I am. What are you? She said. See, he seemed genuinely surprised by the question, like it wasn't one he'd expected to be asked directly. See, difficult, he said. She almost laughed. Not unkindly, there was just something almost disarming about a man who could look at himself that clearly and say it that plainly. See, most men she'd known required a decade of evidence before they'd acknowledge a flaw, and here was Ronan Mercer, offering it up like a line item. See, most people are, she said. They just don't know it. See, he looked at her for a moment, then looked away. See, she went back to her work and let the conversation settle, and the fire crackled, and outside the mountain was doing whatever the mountain did in February in the Blackstone Range. And neither of them spoke again for an hour. See, but it was a different quality of silence than it had been in the first weeks. See, less like a wall, more like the space between words when someone's still thinking. See, by the time the wound was fully closed and he went back to the trap lines in the third week of February, something had changed in the cabin that neither of them had authorized or exactly noticed in the moment it was happening. See, it was in the way they occupied the space, less careful, less deliberate about maintaining distance. See, she no longer tracked where he was before she moved. See, he no longer altered his route around the room to avoid proximity. See, small things. The kind of things you only notice in retrospect, when you're trying to understand how something arrived without an invitation. See, he started eating breakfast before he went out. That sounds small. See, it wasn't. For the first 6 weeks, he'd been out the door before she was fully awake, eating whatever he ate on the mountain in whatever way he managed it out there. See, now he sat at the table. He didn't talk much that hadn't changed, but he sat there, and she sat across from him, and they ate in the companionable quiet of people who had stopped needing to fill silence and started being comfortable inside it. See, she noticed the mornings first. The particular quality of light through the frosted window. See, the way the stove popped and settled when it was burning right. See, the sound of him pulling on his boots, left one always took longer. Some issue with the lacing she'd offered to fix twice, and he'd declined twice, and the specific silence after the door shut that was different now. See, not empty. More like the space between breaths. She did not examine this closely. See, but she noticed it. The second major test between them came not from the mountain, but from something smaller, and therefore, in its way, more dangerous. See, it was an evening in late February, clear and cold and still, and she was reading and he was working at the table on some piece of equipment she hadn't asked about, and she made a comment offhand. See, not loaded, just a thought that surfaced about Thomas. See, my husband used to say that winter was only hard if you didn't have the right equipment, she said. See, he said that about everything, actually. Every problem was just a supply problem. See, she felt Ronan go still without looking up. Was he right? Ronan said. See, about winter sometimes, she said. About people, never. See, a pause. What was wrong with him? Ronan said. The directness of it caught her slightly off guard. See, people didn't usually ask, that they asked what happened to him, or how long they'd been married, or some other question that circled the real one without landing. See, he wasn't bad, she said, which was true and felt important to say first. See, he was just, she thought about how to say it. He was a man who needed a lot of hope to function, and he used up mine along with his. See, Ronan set down whatever he was working on. Did he know that? He said. See, no, she said. I don't think so. I don't think he was paying close enough attention to know. See, did you tell him? The question sat there. At the end, she said. See, too late for it to matter. She paused. I used to think that was a failure of nerve. See, now I think it was just bad timing. I don't know which is worse. See, Ronan looked at her. The firelight was doing things to the angles of his face, making it harder to read than usual, and she couldn't tell what he was thinking, which was true in broad daylight as well, but somehow more acute in the evening. See, worse to know and not say, he said, I think. You sound certain. See, I spent 4 years in an army where nobody said anything true to anyone, he said. See, and I spent 11 years up here where the only person I had to talk to was myself. See, I've had time to think about which was worse. She looked at him. See, which was, she said. The army, he said. At least alone you know where you stand. See, it was the most honest thing he'd said to her, she thought. See, maybe the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years. See, there was no performance in it, no bid for sympathy, no angling toward something. See, just a man telling her a true thing because she'd asked and he'd decided to answer. See, she thought, this is what it looks like when a person is actually present in a conversation. See, she hadn't realized she'd forgotten what that looked like until now. See, thank you, she said. He looked slightly puzzled. See, for what? For answering the actual question, she said. See, he didn't know what to do with that, which was one of the few times she'd seen him visibly uncertain, and she found it not charming exactly. See, but something in that territory, and she looked back at her book before she did something as foolish as let him see it. See, the tin box came to her attention again in the first week of March. See, not because she'd been looking. She was reorganizing the supply shelves she did this monthly, a habit she'd developed because in the closed, static world of the cabin, rotation prevented waste, and she moved the crate, and there it was. See, and this time she was holding it before she'd consciously decided to pick it up. See, she put it down immediately, stepped back, left it alone. See, but that evening, she made the mistake of mentioning it, not to ask about it, just to acknowledge she'd moved things, and returned everything to where it had been. See, I moved the dry goods crate on the south shelf, she said. See, put everything back the way I found it, including. She stopped, which was a mistake, because stopping was more noticeable than finishing. See the box, he said. Yes. He was looking at the fire. See, I didn't open it, she said. I know. She waited because sometimes he continued and sometimes didn't, and she'd stopped trying to predict which. See, my mother's, he said. She said nothing. Letters she wrote. See, a photograph. A lock of hair, he paused. From when she was a girl. See, she gave them to me the day I left for the army. Said she wanted someone to carry them who'd come back. He stopped. See, then she was right that I'd come back. Wrong about what kind. See, Mara was quiet for a long moment. What kind did you come back? She said softly. See, he looked at her, and the firelight caught his eyes, and she saw something in them she hadn't seen before, not sadness exactly, not self-pity, see, but the particular weariness of a person who has carried something heavy for so long they've stopped noticing the weight, except in occasional moments, like this one. See, Queeter, he said. Then she expected. She didn't say she was sorry. See, she didn't say anything for a long while, and the fire settled and the wind moved against the cabin, and she thought about a woman who'd sent her son off to war with her letters and a lock of hair and a promise he'd return. See, and about a man who had returned and found that the version of himself that came back was a stranger even to his own expectations. See, she'd be glad you kept them, she said finally. He looked at her. See, I don't know what she'd be, he said. But he said it less like a denial and more like he was considering the possibility for the first time. See, it was the evening everything shifted, though she wouldn't understand that until later. See, it wasn't dramatic. There was no particular moment she could point to and say, there, that was it. See, it was more that by the time she went to bed that night, something had resettled inside her, the way furniture settles after a house has been lived in long enough, not where it started, but finally in the right place. See, she lay in the dark and listened to him breathe on the other side of the room and thought about transactions and what they became when they lasted long enough and involved enough honesty. See, she thought about the line on the floor that was gone and whether its disappearance was neutral or not. See, she thought about his wife 11 years ago, who had felt alone even with him there, and whether the woman who'd said that had understood what she was walking away from, or whether she'd only known what she couldn't live with. See, she did not let herself finish that train of thought. See, she was smart enough to know that thinking clearly about a person at midnight, in the dark, when you can hear them breathe, was not the same as thinking clearly about them. See, the crisis arrived, the real one, the one she hadn't braced for on a Tuesday in the first week of March. See, it began ordinarily. Ronan went out early on the trap lines. See, the weather was clear and cold and manageable, the kind of day that felt like the mountain giving you back something after weeks of punishment. See, she did the morning work, cooked, and was in the middle of repairing a split in one of the supply bags when she heard him come back. See, too early. She knew it before the door opened, the way you know things sometimes without a reason, something in the quality of the footsteps, or the sound the door latch made, see, or just the intuition of someone who has spent months in close proximity to a person's rhythms. See, he came in and she looked up and his face was wrong. See, not the blizzard wound wrong, not physical. This was internal, something behind his eyes, the specific tight blankness of a person managing something they hadn't planned to manage. See, what happened? She said. He set down his pack, stood with his back to her for a moment, and she watched him breathe. See, I went to the East Ridge, he said. There's a survey stake. See, she put down the supply bag. Western Meridian, she said. See, new one. Driven in since the last snow, which means recently. He turned. See, his face was still flat, still controlled, but his eyes were something else. See, they're staking the property line 100 yards inside my boundary. See, it's not legal, but it means they have someone up here watching. See, her stomach dropped. They're not waiting for the magistrate, she said. See, no, he said. They're not. She thought fast. How long do we have before the pass opens, she said. See, 6 weeks, maybe 7. So the magistrate arrives in 6 weeks. See, if nothing changes, and if the railway makes a move before then, see, he looked at her steadily. Then we have a problem the magistrate can't solve. See, she stood up. See, crossed the room to the window without fully deciding to, and looked out at the white landscape that had been their entire world for 11 weeks, and thought about Silas Vane and the Western Meridian Railway Company, and men like Creditor Hollis, see, who slammed papers on tables and walked away like the people those papers affected were furniture. See, they'll try to say the marriage isn't real, she said. See, yes. They'll call me a paid woman. They'll try, he said, and there was something in those 2 words, something quiet and absolute, that she felt in her sternum. See, she turned from the window. He was looking at her with that direct, weighted look, the one she'd started to understand was not natural for him, was something he did when what he was saying mattered and he needed her to receive it accurately. See, I won't let them do that, he said. Ronan, I want to be clear, he said. See, whatever else this arrangement is, you came here and you stayed and you kept this house and you kept me alive in that and I won't stand in front of anyone and let them make that into something ugly. See, she looked at him. I know, she said. He nodded, looked away. See, picked up his pack and began unpacking it with the brisk efficiency he used to manage discomfort. And she watched him and thought about what he'd just said, not what it told her about the railway, but what it told her about him. See, she let it sit where he'd put it, but she didn't set it aside. See, the next several weeks had a different texture than the ones before. See, not worse, exactly, but more charged, like the air before a storm that you can feel but can't yet see. See, Ronan went out each day, and she knew he was checking the survey stakes and watching the ridge lines and doing whatever a man with 7 years of mountain knowledge does when he suspects someone is moving against him. See, he didn't tell her everything, which was both expected and, she found, slightly irritating, not because she needed to know every detail, but because she wasn't a person who functioned well in uncertainty she hadn't consented to. See, she told him that on a Thursday. If they're watching us, she said, I need to know what you know. See, all of it. I'm not useful to you if I'm missing half the information. See, he looked at her like she'd said something surprising. See, I wasn't trying to protect you, he said. I know, she said. See, you were trying to carry it yourself because that's what you do. See, and I'm telling you that's not the arrangement anymore. See, you want this to look like a real household? This is what a real household looks like. See, you tell me things, I tell you things. We figure it out together, or we figure it out worse. See, a long pause. Fair, he said. After that, he told her things. See, some of it was practical, the locations of the stakes, the direction of the survey, his estimate of when and how the railway would move. See, some of it was less practical and more personal, that his father had sold timber rights on the North Quarter without telling him, that the railway had been building toward this claim for 3 years. See, that the specific shape of the threat was something his father had, perhaps intentionally, left him to manage alone. See, he knew, she said, when he'd laid it all out. Yes, Ronan said. See, he knew the railway was circling, and he put the marriage condition in the will anyway. See, yes. So either he thought you'd marry, or he didn't think I would, Ronan said, and the land would end up with them. He was quiet for a moment. See, I've never decided which, whether it was control or punishment or both. See, she looked at him. Did he know about your wife? She said. See, that she'd left? Yes. Then he knew you'd need help you didn't have, she said. See, something moved across his face. He knew a lot of things, he said, and the flatness of it told her everything about what it had cost him to spend his whole life being known by someone who used that knowledge as leverage. See, she thought about fathers who turned love into conditions and wondered how many men were walking around carrying the shape of what they'd been taught to expect from people. See, and whether any of them had chosen it consciously or just absorbed it the way water absorbs the shape of whatever holds it. See, she thought about what it meant to offer someone a transaction when what you actually needed was something else entirely. See, whether knowing that was the same as being able to choose differently. See, she didn't resolve any of these thoughts, but she held them, and the fire burned, and Ronan sat across the table with the map of his property spread between them, and they planned, together, for whatever was coming down the mountain. See, the night it finally broke was a Saturday, mid-March, cold and clear, the stars visible in the way they only are at altitude, huge and close, like something that could come through the window if it wanted to. See, she had been doing something at the workbench. He had been sitting by the fire. See, she'd said something she couldn't even remember what. Something small and observational about the sound the wind was making, and he'd said nothing, and she'd turned to look at him, and she found him watching her. See, not glancing, not the quick peripheral attention she'd caught before. See, watching her, directly and without the usual guardedness, in the way that told her it had been happening for longer than the second she'd caught it in. See, she looked back. Neither of them moved. Then he looked at the fire, and she looked at the workbench, and neither of them said a word, and the silence that followed was the loudest silence the cabin had produced since December. See, she lay awake that night for a long time. She thought about a line on a floor that was gone. See, she thought about a man who had told her very plainly what he didn't want, and who had spent 11 weeks behaving in every way but words like someone who had changed his mind. See, she thought about the difference between what a person says they need and what they reach for in the dark, and whether honoring the first at the expense of the second was wisdom or just a very convincing kind of fear. See, she thought, this man saved nothing for himself. He gave away his mother's letters, his years, his capacity for ease. See, he is giving away this too, whatever it is, by watching her when he thinks she isn't watching, and leaving books on workbenches, and saying things like, I won't let them make that into something ugly. See, she thought, I have been alone for a long time. Alone in company, which is the worst kind. See, and I am not going to pretend that I don't know what it feels like to not be. See, she also thought. He said, the terms haven't changed. See, he said it deliberately. She realized now. He said it because he needed to believe it. See, the same way she'd told herself for weeks that this was only a transaction, only survival, only the mathematics of a necessary arrangement, because the alternative was feeling something she hadn't consented to and couldn't afford. See, but the thing about winter at altitude is that it strips everything back. See, there's no distraction, no crowd, no convenient noise to hide in. See, there's just the fire and the cold and the two of you, and eventually you can't pretend not to see what's in the room. See, she made a decision somewhere around 3 in the morning. See, she didn't act on it immediately. That wasn't how she operated. She thought things through, sat with them, made sure she wasn't responding to a feeling that would look different in daylight. See, she sat with it for 3 days. And at the end of 3 days, when she was still certain, she picked her moment. See, he was at the table. She was across from him. The lantern was between them, and its light made the worn wood glow and turned the shadows in the corners deep and soft. See, she said, Ronan. He looked up. No, you said the terms haven't changed, she said. See, his face went very still. And I'm not asking you to change them, she said. See, I'm asking you to tell me the truth. One question. See, one honest answer. He didn't say anything, but he didn't look away. See, do you watch me? See, she said. Because you want to. See, or because you can't help it. See, the fire crackled. The wind moved past the window. See, he looked at her for a long time. Long enough that she thought he was going to retreat, going to find some careful, deniable answer that preserved the distance he'd built, and the rule he'd stated, and the safe, cold version of this winter that didn't require him to be any braver than survival demanded. See, then he said very quietly both. She looked at him across the lantern light. See, that's what I thought, she said. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, just his hand. Nothing else, the same steadiness she'd used cleaning his wound. See, the same deliberate calm, and she held it for 3 seconds. And then she stood up and went to bed and left him sitting there in the light, with his hand on the table and the mountain pressing cold and vast around the cabin walls. See, she did not sleep immediately. See, but she slept eventually, and when she woke in the morning, he had already made the fire, and there was a bowl of something hot on the workbench waiting for her, and he was outside in the early gray light-splitting wood with the efficient, focused energy of a man who has made a decision and is working out what to do with it. See, she wrapped her hands around the bowl and drank and watched him through the frosted glass of the window and thought, 6 weeks to spring. See, 6 weeks before the magistrate came and the railway made its move, and everything they'd built in this mountain winter was put in front of strangers to be judged. See, 6 weeks to figure out what was true. She was ready. See, he didn't mention it the next morning. She hadn't expected him to Ronan. Mercer was not a man who processed things quickly and then talked about them. See, he processed slowly, internally, with the particular thoroughness of someone who had spent years with no one to externalize anything to, and she had learned by now to give that room. See, pushing him was like pushing the mountain. It didn't move on your schedule. See, but something had changed, and she could feel it in the quality of the air between them. See, he still went out early. He still came back at dusk, smelling of cold and pine, and the particular outdoor smell she'd stopped noticing 3 weeks in. See, he still ate with the efficiency of a man fueling a machine rather than enjoying a meal. See, but the way he moved through the cabin was different, less contained, less deliberately bounded. See, he sat closer at the table. He handed her things rather than setting them down and stepping back. See, small shifts. The kind that meant nothing individually and meant everything added together. See, on the second morning after what she'd started privately calling the lantern moment, she woke to find him still inside. See, he was at the table with a piece of paper and a pencil, drawing something, and he didn't look up when she got up. See, but he also didn't do the thing he used to do, where his whole posture communicated that her movement through the space was not his concern. See, she made coffee, real coffee, the last of what she'd brought from Red Hollow. She'd been rationing it for months and set a cup next to him without looking at what he was drawing. See, thank you, he said. Last of the beans, she said. See, I know. He picked up the cup. still didn't look up from the paper. See, I have more at the bottom of the south crate, behind the flour. See, she looked at him. You've been hiding coffee, she said. See, saving it. For what? He looked up then. For when we ran out of yours. See, she stared at him for a moment, and he looked back with that neutral, unreadable expression that she now knew was not actually neutral, that in fact contained more than most people communicated with full use of their faces. See, she sat down across from him. Let me see what you're drawing, she said. See, he turned the paper. It was the homestead, the cabin, the animal shelter, a rough outline of the property. See, but he'd added things. A larger room on the north side of the cabin, a proper storage structure separate from the current lean-to, a marked path to the spring that he'd apparently been improving. See, it wasn't the drawing of a man planning for spring and a magistrate's inspection. See, it was the drawing of a man planning further ahead than that. See, she looked at it for a long time. When did you start this? She said. See, a few weeks ago, he said. She looked up. Before or after the blizzard, she said. See, he picked up his coffee cup. After. She looked back at the drawing and felt something move through her chest that she didn't name, because naming it would make it something she had to decide about, and she wasn't ready for that yet. See, instead, she said, the storage structure should be closer to the cabin. See, 12 feet, not 20. In a real storm, 20 feet is too far. See, he looked at the drawing, picked up the pencil, moved the structure. He better, she said. See, he nodded once, see, and went back to work. See, and she sat across from him with her coffee and watched the pale March light come through the window and thought about the difference between a man who builds things because he has to and a man who builds. See, things because he's planning to still be somewhere. See, the argument, when it finally came, arrived from a direction she hadn't anticipated. See, it wasn't about the hand on the table or the watching or the lantern or any of the things she'd thought might eventually break the surface. See, it was about something smaller, which is how the real ones usually start. See, it was a Wednesday. Ronan had been out since before dawn, doing something on the East Ridge, checking the survey stakes again. She assumed, see, though he hadn't said, and he came back in the early afternoon with a look on his face that she'd learned to categorize as controlled anger. See, which was different from his regular containment, because it had a specific tightness around his eyes that his ordinary blankness didn't. See, they moved the stake again, she said, not as a question. See, 20 feet further in, he said. He set down his pack and stood in the middle of the room. See, third time. What does that mean legally? It means they're establishing a pattern, he said. See, trying to demonstrate that the boundary has always been disputed. See, if they can get that in front of the right judge. See, Magistrate Vale isn't the right judge. Magistrate Vale is assigned to the homestead claim, he said. See, the boundary dispute would go to a different court. See, different judges. Different. He stopped. Different relationships with the railway. She finished. See, yes. She thought about this, so even if Vale approves the claim, see, they could still challenge the boundary and take the East Quarter, he said. See, maybe more. She stood up and went to the window, looking out at the mountain that was just starting to show the first tentative signs of change, nothing dramatic, just a slightly different quality to the light in the afternoons. See, a degree or two of thaw that vanished by night, but was there in the middle of the day if you knew to look. See, we need documentation, she said. Records. Anything that shows the original boundary before they started moving stakes. See, I have my father's survey from 1871, he said. I have correspondence with the county office. See, I've had it all along. Then we use it. It's not that simple, Mara. See, I know it's not simple, she said, turning from the window. See, I'm not saying simple. I'm saying we have something and we should use it. See, he looked at her with the particular expression that she'd learned meant he was about to disagree, but was calculating how to do it without it turning into something larger. See, the problem, he said, see carefully, see, is that the railway has lawyers. See, they've been preparing this for 3 years. Whatever documents I have, they have responses to already. See, they've thought further ahead than we have. Then we need to think further ahead than they expect us to, she said. See, with what I'm a trapper, Mara, I don't have. You have me, she said. See, the words came out before she'd fully intended them, not as an offer, but as a statement of fact. and they landed in the room with a weight that surprised both of them. See, he looked at her. I know how to read contracts, she said, pressing forward because stopping now would make it into something more loaded than she meant it to be. See, Thomas had legal trouble his whole marriage. I sat in on enough discussions with lawyers to understand how these things work. See, I know what evidence looks like, and I know how to present it, and I know how men like Silas Vane operate, because I've sat across the table from men like Silas Vane and watched them work. See, a pause. You never said that, he said. You never asked. See, he stared at her. I didn't mean it as a criticism, she said, which was only partly true. See, I mean that we've been managing this as your problem. And it's not only your problem anymore. And if we're going to fight the railway, we need to fight it the way they're fighting it. See, which means with everything we have, and not just the parts you've decided to manage on your own. See, he was quiet for a moment. Then, you're angry. I'm practical, she said. See, you're angry, he said again, more certain this time. See, why? She looked at him. And she realized, in the way you sometimes realize things when someone asks the right question at the right moment, that she was angry, and that the anger was not entirely about the railway. See, because you do this, she said. You carry things by yourself until they get too heavy, and then you're surprised when they're heavy. See, you were doing it before I got here, and you've been doing it since, and I understand why I do. I know where it comes from, but it's not actually strength, Ronan. See, it's a habit, and habits can be wrong. The silence that followed was not comfortable. See, he looked at her with that flat, controlled expression, and she looked back without softening it, because she'd said a true thing, and she wasn't going to apologize for a true thing, and she waited to see which direction he was going to go. See, he went somewhere she hadn't expected. You're right, he said. See, just that. No qualifier, no defense, no counter. She blinked. See, it's a habit, he said, and it's... He made the short, restless hand movement she'd come to recognize as him reaching for a word he didn't like. See, it's gotten me through things. See, it's also gotten me to a place where I'm standing in my own cabin at 34 years old with no one who knows what I'm thinking and a railway company taking bites out of my land while I try to manage it alone. He stopped. See, so, you're right. She looked at him for a moment. See, show me the documents, she said. He got the documents. See, they spent the rest of the afternoon at the table with his father's survey maps, and the county correspondence spread between them, and Mara went through everything with the focused, systematic attention she'd learned from years of sitting beside Thomas, while lawyers explained things she couldn't afford to misunderstand. See, and Ronan watched her work with the same quality of attention she'd noticed before, the kind that wasn't assessment or appreciation exactly, but something in between, something she filed away and didn't look at directly. See, the survey from 1871 was clear. The boundary was clear. See, the railway's current position of the stakes was indefensible on paper, which meant they were betting on something other than the documents, probably on Vale being cooperative, or on Ronan being underprepared, see, or on Mara being exactly what Silas Vane would claim she was, a hired woman with no stake in the outcome. See, that last one made her jaw tight. They're going to come at me, she said. See, yes, Ronan said. He didn't dress it up. What will they say? See, he was quiet for a moment. That you're not a real wife, he said. See, that the household isn't genuine. That the marriage was performed for the purpose of the inheritance and should be voided. See, and how do we prove otherwise? He looked at the table. See, I don't know that we prove it, he said. I think he stopped. See, I think a man who's known a real household and a false one can tell the difference when he walks into a room. See, I think Magistrate Vale is that kind of man. She looked at him. See, have you met him? Once. Years ago, he was a fair man, a pause. See, fair doesn't mean easy. No, she said, it never does. See, they worked until the lantern needed filling, and then she filled it, and they worked some more. See, and by the time they stopped, her eyes were tired, and her back ached from bending over the table, and she was more certain than when she'd started that they had a defensible position, see, which was not the same as a comfortable one, but was considerably better than nothing. See, she stood up and stretched. Mara, he said. She looked down at him. See, he was looking at the survey map, not at her. After spring, he said. See, after the magistrate comes and the claim is settled. He stopped. See, yes, she said. He looked up then. I'd like you to stay, he said. See, not quickly, not nervously, not with any of the trappings of a man making a proposal he's uncertain about. See, he said it the way he said everything that mattered, direct, flat, leaving no room for misunderstanding. See, not for the land, not for the railway. I want you to stay because I want you here. See, she looked at him. She thought about the $14 in her shoe in Red Hollow, and Creditor Hollis walking out, and the moment in the boarding house hallway when she'd looked at this man and calculated her odds and decided to shake his hand. See, she thought about $400 up front and a contract and a line on the floor that was gone. See, she thought about his wife, who'd left because she felt alone even when he was there. See, she thought about whether she felt alone when he was there. See, she did not. Let's get through spring first, she said. See, he nodded, looked back at the map, but she saw, before he looked down, the thing that crossed his face, not relief, exactly, and not quite satisfaction, but something in the territory between them that had a future tense in it. See, she went to her side of the room and lay down and stared at the ceiling and thought, I have not said yes. See, I have also not said no. And the difference between those two things is a conversation that is going to happen. And I don't know yet how it goes. See, but for the first time in a long time, she was genuinely curious to find out. See, the mountain pass opened earlier than expected. Ronan had predicted 6 weeks, maybe 7. See, it was 4.5. The late winter had been brutal enough that when it finally broke, it broke dramatically. See, temperature climbing in a week's span in a way that melted the upper snowpack fast and opened the track down to Red Hollow faster than either of them had planned for. See, she knew because she saw his face when he came in from checking the ridge line on the 1st of April. See, pass is clear, he said. She put down what she was doing. See, how clear? Clear enough for a wagon, he said, which means clear enough for the railway. See, they looked at each other. How long do we have, she said. See, days, he said, not weeks. She took a breath. All right, she said. See, they spent the next 2 days in a focused, productive frenzy that felt like the weeks before the blizzard, but compressed, checking everything, organizing the documents. See, making sure the homestead was as clearly and genuinely functional as it had been all winter, which it was, because it had actually been functional all winter and didn't need to be manufactured. See, the extra room Ronan had started building on the north side wasn't finished, but its framing was up and its purpose was evident. See, and Mara arranged the interior of the main cabin with the dual understanding that it needed to look like what it was, a household where 2 people had genuinely been living without looking staged. See, she looked at the room on the 4th day with fresh eyes, trying to see it the way a stranger would. See, what she saw was 2 coffee cups, both used, a mended coat hanging by the door that was too large for her and too carefully repaired for someone indifferent to it. See, a book on the workbench with 2 different sets of fingerprints worn into the cover. See, a stove that had been managed with the specific expertise of someone who'd learned its particular quirks. See, shelves organized in a system that wasn't how they'd started and wasn't how one person alone would arrange them. See, she thought, this looks real because it is real. That was either their strongest argument or their most complicated one. See, on the 5th day after the pass cleared, she was outside checking the supply inventory in the storage structure when she heard horses. See, she went still. 3 riders coming up from the south track. See, they were still a distance out, but she could see the quality of their horses, not working animals, not the rough mountain stock you used for serious terrain. These were town horses, well kept, see, which meant their riders had not come up from Red Hollow the hard way. See, she went inside. Riders, she said. Ronan was already at the window. See, he'd heard them too. She watched him look at the approaching figures for a moment. See, his face did the thing it did closed. Still, everything moved behind the wall, and then he turned from the window and looked at her. See, whatever happens, he said. Whatever they say to you. See, I know how to handle myself, she said. I know you do, he said. See, I'm not asking you to handle yourself. I'm asking you to let me. He stopped. See, made the hand motion. Let me be the one standing between you and what's coming. See, that's all I'm asking. She looked at him. She understood what he was actually saying, which was not about the railway. See, or not only. All right, she said. He nodded. Went to the door. See, There were three of them. Magistrate Edwin Vale, who was older than she'd expected, mid-60s, neat silver hair, the kind of careful, observant eyes that came from a lifetime of evaluating what people showed him versus what they were, and two men from the railway company. One was a clerk type, small and neat with a leather case. The other was Silas Vane. She knew Vane immediately from the way he arrived. He dismounted first, before Vale had fully stopped his horse, with the specific energy of a man who treats courtesy as weakness and has been too rewarded for that to reconsider it. He was maybe 50, broad-shouldered, wearing the kind of coat that cost more than anything she'd owned in the last 3 years. And his eyes went to her before they went to the cabin, before they went to the documents, before they went to anything else. She held his gaze and didn't move. Mr. Mercer, Vale said, approaching Ronan with a handshake. I appreciate the difficulty of the journey. Magistrate, Ronan said. You're welcome to come inside. Vane was looking at Mara. And this is the wife, he said. Not a question. The way you identify a piece of furniture. Ronan stepped between them. It was a small movement. He didn't make a show of it, didn't puff himself up or plant himself dramatically. He simply shifted so that he was between Mara and Vane, and said without particular heat, "This is my wife." Mara Mercer. He used her name with his. She had not, she realized, heard that before. Mara Mercer. She'd been Mara Whitlock in her own mind for so long that hearing it in someone else's voice, his voice did something to her chest that she needed to put away immediately and deal with at another time. Yes, she said. Please come inside. Vane did not move immediately. He was still looking at her with the particular calculating look of a man who is trying to identify the weakness in a thing before he decides how to break it. How long have you been here? He said to her. Since December, she said. December. He repeated it like it was suspicious. And before that Red Hollow, she said. You knew, Mr. Mercer before the marriage. She looked at him evenly. I knew him well enough to marry him. Vane's eyes moved to Ronan. Convenient timing, he said, given the inheritance condition. Convenient for me, Mara said, drawing his attention back. I had debts and he had land, and we made a decision. That's how most of the marriages in this territory work, Mr. Vane. I don't know what kind you're accustomed to, but love isn't always where it starts. Something shifted in Vane's expression, slight recalibration. Shall we go in? Vale said mildly, in the tone of a man who has refereed these conversations before and prefers to do it out of the wind. They went inside. What followed was 3 hours that required everything she had. Vale conducted himself exactly as Ronan had predicted, thorough, fair, unhurried. He asked straightforward questions and listened to the answers with attention rather than waiting to poke holes, and she found herself thinking that he was the kind of man her mother would have respected, which was not nothing. He asked about her daily routine. She told him. He asked about the stove. She explained the damper trick, offhand, the way you explain something you've done 1,000 times. He looked at the shelves. She saw his eyes move over them, the way someone's eyes move over a bookshelf to understand the person who built it. He looked at the mended coat. He looked at the 2 coffee cups. He asked Ronan to describe the layout of the supply storage. Ronan answered. Then Vale asked Mara the same question. Apparently, she understood this immediately to see whether their answers matched because they'd lived it or matched because they'd rehearsed it. Their answers matched because they'd lived it, and she suspected Vale could hear the difference. Vane, meanwhile, moved around the cabin like a man looking for something specific and trying not to make it obvious. He looked at the beds. He looked at the configuration of personal items. He looked with no expression at the space between them. He found his moment during a lull while Vale was reviewing the property documents with Ronan. He came to stand near her, not threatening, just proximate in the way that was designed to be unsettling, and said quietly, $1,000. She looked at him. That's what he paid you, Vane said. We have a record of the withdrawal. Her heart hit harder once and then steadied. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. 400 in December, he said, which is exactly the kind of sum a man pays a woman he needs to produce for an inheritance inspection. He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that had no warmth in it anywhere. See, how much is he paying you for today specifically, Mrs. C. Whitlock? The use of her first name, her old name, was deliberate. See, she knew it was deliberate, and she felt it land the way it was intended to, like a needle finding the right spot. See, she looked at him steadily. Mercer, she said. My name is Mara Mercer. See, for now, he said, Mr. Vane. Ronan's voice came from across the room. See, she hadn't seen him look up from the documents. She didn't know how he'd heard it. The conversation had been quiet. See, but he'd heard something, or seen something, because he was looking at Vane now with the specific, very still quality that she'd seen once before, on the morning he'd come back from checking the East Ridge stake for the third time. See, you have questions about the property, Ronan said. You ask them of me. See, I heard what you were simply doing, Ronan said. See, he set down the survey map and crossed the room and put himself, again, between Mara and Vane. And she was standing close enough this time to feel the shift in the air, the specific temperature of a large, capable man who has decided exactly where his limit is. See, I want to be clear about something, Ronan said. And he was speaking to Vane, but it was loud enough for the room. See, you have every right to inspect this property and question this claim. See, that's the law, and I respect it. What you don't have is the right to stand in my home and imply things about my wife that are not true. See, you do that again, and the inspection is over, and you can take it up with Vale in Red Hollow. See, Vane looked at him. Protective, Vane said. For a man who married her 4 months ago. See, yes, Ronan said. Simple, no apology in it. Vale looked up from his chair. See, Mr. Vane, he said, with the tone of a man who has been patient long enough. See, I'll conduct the questioning. Vane stepped back. See, but his eyes, moving past Ronan, found hers, and what she saw in them was not defeat, it was adjustment. See, he was recalculating. She'd seen that before, too, in lawyers and creditors, and men who'd underestimated her and were deciding whether to revise upward or find a different angle. See, she had the specific cold feeling of knowing this was not over. See, Vale called them both to the table and spent another hour going through the documents. And Mara presented the survey map and the county correspondence and the boundary records with the organized clarity she'd prepared. See, and Vale listened and made notes and asked questions that told her he was tracking the railway's stake movement and understood exactly what it meant and did not need to be told twice. See, when Vale finally sat back in his chair, he looked at Ronan and then at Mara and then around the cabin one more time with those careful, experienced eyes. See, I've been doing this for 22 years, he said. See, I've seen legitimate households, and I've seen arrangements passed off as households. And I want to tell you that the difference is usually apparent within the first 10 minutes. He paused. See, it's apparent here. Vane made a sound that stopped short of being a protest. See, the boundary dispute is a separate matter, Vale continued. See, I'll recommend an independent survey, which the railway will not enjoy. See, but the homestead claim is straightforward. He closed his case. See, this household is legitimate. The claim stands. She felt Ronan exhale beside her. See, she felt it in her own chest. And then Vane said, I'd like to note, for the record, that the Western Meridian Railway Company reserves the right to challenge any claim established under. See, noted, Vale said, standing, as it will be in my report, along with the irregularities in your stake positioning. He looked at Vane without warmth. See, I'd advise your company to be careful, Mr. Vane. Judges in this territory have long memories for land practices that test the definition of legal. See, Vane said nothing. Vale shook Ronan's hand. He shook Mara's hand. See, his grip was firm, and his eyes, when they met hers, had a quality she couldn't fully name, something like recognition. Maybe the look of a man who had seen a particular thing before and was glad to see it again. See, Mrs. Mercer, he said. You've built something solid up here. See, we have, she said. He nodded once and went to his horse. See, Vane left without speaking to either of them again, which was its own kind of answer about how he assessed the situation. See, the clerk followed. She and Ronan stood in the cabin doorway and watched the three riders go back down the south track, and neither of them spoke until the riders had gone around the bend in the tree line and disappeared. See, then Ronan said, It's done. The claim is done, she said. See, the boundary dispute isn't. No, he agreed. But Vale gave us what we need for that. He paused. See, you presented those documents better than any lawyer I've seen. See, she looked at the empty track. I had a good teacher, she said. See, expensive and useless in the end, but good. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. See, she'd heard that sound maybe 4 times over the course of the winter, and each time it surprised her the way a window opening in a room you thought was sealed surprises you. See, she went back inside. He followed. She was at the workbench, beginning to put the documents back in order, when she heard him cross the room and then stop, and she turned to find him standing at the table, see, looking at her with an expression that was the least guarded she had seen on him since the morning after the lantern. See, he picked something up from the table. She didn't see it at first. See, then she did. He was holding the remaining $500. See, the second half of the contract. The payment she'd been owed since the first of spring. See, he set it on the table between them, and the whole room changed. See, she looked at the money, then at him, then at the money again. See, and she felt the bottom drop out of something she'd been very carefully not examining. See, because the claim was done. The magistrate had come. See, the season had turned. The contract, the thing she'd shaken his hand over in a boarding house hallway in December, in another life, was fulfilled. See, the transaction was complete. She looked at the coins on the table. See, she thought about what she'd told herself in the first weeks. See, a transaction. Separate lives. 4 months. Done. She thought about March evenings and coffee saved in the bottom of a crate. See, she thought about a book with 2 sets of fingerprints worn into the cover. See, she thought about him stepping between her and Vane today twice, without being asked, and saying "my wife like it" was the most natural word in the language. See, she thought about what he'd asked 2 weeks ago in the lantern light, "I'd like you to stay." See, and she thought about what she'd said, "Let's get through spring first." See, spring was here, and he had put the money on the table. See, she felt something moving through her that she didn't have a clean name for, part grief, part anger, part something rawer that she wasn't going to let herself sit with in front of him until she understood it better. See, she picked up her coat from the hook by the door. "I'll need to arrange transport," she said. See, her voice came out steady, which was more than she'd expected. See, from Red Hollow. She heard him go very still behind her. See, "What?" he said. "The claim is settled," she said. See, "You fulfilled the contract. I'll take the money," and she stopped. See, steadied. "I'll need a few days to arrange things." See, the silence that followed was different from any silence the cabin had produced in 5 months. "See, Mara," he said. "You paid me," she said. She kept her back to him, because if she turned around she was going to see his face, and she wasn't ready for that yet. See, "The contract is complete." She stopped again. See, "That's what we agreed to." "That's not," he stopped. See, she heard him move. "That's not what I meant." "I know what you meant," she said, which was almost true. See, "Then why are you—" "Because you put the money on the table," she said, and now her voice had something in it that wasn't steadiness. See, "You could have said anything to me. You could have said anything. See, and instead you put the money on the table." She put her hand on the door. See, "That tells me where we are," she said. She opened it and walked out into the April air, which was cold and clean and smelled like snowmelt and pine and the particular freshness of a mountain in the first days of becoming something other than winter. See, she stood outside in it and breathed and looked at the Blackstone Range spread around her in every direction, massive and indifferent, and, in its way, see, beautiful, and thought about 5 months, and what they'd built, and what they'd been careful not to say. See, behind her she heard the door open. He stepped out. See, she didn't turn around. "Mara," he said, "look at me." See, she turned. His face was the most open she'd ever seen it. See, not soft, he wasn't a soft man, and he wasn't going to become one, but open, in the specific way of a person who has run out of wall to stand behind and has decided that the next thing has to be the true thing. See, "I put the money there because it was yours," he said. See, "It was always yours. I wasn't stopped. I wasn't paying you to leave." See, she looked at him. "Then what were you doing?" she said. See, he looked back at her. The mountain was behind him, enormous and white and permanent, and he stood in front of it, looking like what he was, a man who had spent his whole life in difficult places and was in one now of a completely different kind. See, I didn't know how to ask again, he said. I asked once, and you said wait until spring. And spring came, and I didn't know if the answer had changed, and I didn't. He stopped. See, I didn't want to put a condition on the money. I didn't want you to think you had to stay to earn it, or stay to be safe. See, I wanted the money to be yours, and the choice to be yours. See, separate. She stared at him. So it wasn't dismissal, she said. See, no, he said. It was, he made the hand movement, the short, restless reach for a word. See, it was the worst possible way to communicate that. See, I know that. She looked at him for a long moment. See, the mountain held its silence around them. You are, she said slowly, genuinely terrible at this. See, yes, he said without qualification. You watched me put on my coat. See, yes. And you didn't say anything. He stopped. See, I was trying to figure out what to say. Ronan, she said. See, I sat up 3 days straight keeping you alive. I walked into a blizzard for you. See, I organized your supply shelves and fixed your coat and held this house together for 5 months. And I presented your documents to a magistrate this afternoon. And when I turned around and saw the money on the table, I thought. She stopped. See, I thought you were telling me we were done. He looked at her. See, we're not done, he said. I don't want to be done. He said it plainly, with the specific flatness that meant he'd stripped all the performance out of it, and what was left was just the true thing. See, I want you to stay. Not for the land, not for the winter. See, I want you to stay because this is the first time in a long time that I've come home to something. He paused. See, you made it something. I don't know how to say that without it sounding like I'm telling you what you did for me, and I know you don't need to hear what you did for me. See, you know what you did. He stopped. He was struggling, and she could see it, the specific labor of a man who has the feeling absolutely clearly and the language for it nowhere near his hand. See, I need you to understand, he said, that I'm not asking you to stay because of what this place needs. See, I'm asking because of what I need, which is you. Here, he stopped. See, that's all. She looked at him standing in front of the mountain he'd spent 7 years on alone, saying the truest thing he'd ever said in that particular flat, undecorated way. He said everything. See, and she felt the thing in her chest that she'd been managing for 5 months finally stop being managed. See, she walked toward him. She stopped 2 feet away. The money stays, she said. See, it was always yours, he said. And the choice stays. See, always, he said. She looked at him for one more moment. See, then I'm choosing to stay, she said. Not because I don't have anywhere else to go. See, I have somewhere else to go now. You paid me enough to go. See, I'm choosing to stay because I want to. She looked at him steadily. See, do you understand the difference? Yes, he said. See, are you sure? Mara, he said. And the way he said it, just her name, the same way he'd said it the first night of the fever, like it was the only word that Fit told her he was sure. See, she reached out and took his hand. Not the careful, deliberate 3 seconds from the lantern night. See, she took it fully, the way you take something you intend to keep, and his hand closed around hers, with the contained, careful strength she'd first noticed in the boarding house hallway, when she'd thought, see, this man could break things and is choosing not to. See, he was still choosing not to. The April sky was cold and enormous above them, and somewhere down the south track the railway's horses were still making their way back to Red Hollow, and neither of those things mattered even slightly. See, she stood with her hand in his and looked at the homestead they'd built in the worst 4 months the mountain had offered. See, and thought about what a transaction becomes when it involves enough honesty and enough time, and 2 people who are too stubborn to pretend they don't need each other. See, it becomes something else. She didn't have a cleaner name for it than that. See, but standing here in the cold April air, with his hand warm around hers and the mountain finally quiet around them both, she thought that something else was enough. See, they stayed outside longer than was practical. See, the April air had teeth in it still this high up. Spring was not a gentle arrival, but a negotiation. Warmth offered in the afternoons and taken back before dark, and her hand was cold inside his by the time either of them thought to move. See, but neither moved first for a long time, and she thought later that this was probably the most honest thing about that moment. 2 people who had spent 5 months being careful, finally being still in the same place without the carefulness. See, he spoke first. You should know, he said, looking not at her but at the tree line to the south where the riders had gone, that the boundary dispute isn't going to be quick. See, Vale's recommendation for an independent survey is the right move, but the railway will delay it. See, 6 months, maybe more. I know, she said. It'll mean more people coming up here. See, more questions. I know that too. He looked at her then. See, I'm telling you it's not over, he said. Not the hard part. See, she looked back at him steadily. Ronan, she said. See, I walked into a blizzard for you in February. I think we've established I'm not frightened of hard. See, something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the family. See, no, he said, you're not. See, she let go of his hand, not because she wanted to, but because they were standing in the open air in early April, and her fingers were genuinely going numb. And she was not going to allow frostbite to turn a meaningful moment into a medical situation. See, come inside, she said. I'll make coffee. You finished the coffee, he said. See, you hid more in the south crate. He followed her inside. See, the cabin felt different that evening. See, not physically, nothing had changed. The same walls, the same stove, the same 2 chairs at the same table, but the quality of the air was different. The way a room feels different after a window has been opened and closed again. See, something had moved through, something had cleared. See, she made coffee, and he sat at the table, and neither of them talked about what had happened outside, which was fine, because it didn't need to be talked about. See, it had been said, it had been heard. What came next was not more talking, but the specific, unglamorous work of actually building the thing they'd both just agreed to build, and both of them understood that without needing to discuss it. See, what she said, sitting across from him with her hands wrapped around her cup, was, "Tell me about the North Edition. See, what you're planning." He looked up. "Now, you have the drawings," she said. "See, we have time." He got the drawings. They sat at the table until late that night, going over the expansion plans, the way they'd gone over the survey documents before the magistrate's visit, with the particular focused energy of 2 people who have, see, stopped pretending they're not invested in the outcome. See, she had thoughts. He had responses to the thoughts. See, they disagreed twice, meaningfully, about the placement of the interior wall and the orientation of the new window. See, and worked through it the way people work through things when they're not performing, not smoothly, not without friction, but forward. See, always forward. At some point, without either of them deciding it, the plans became plans for both of them. See, not his cabin with a guest room, not a trapper's homestead with an accommodation for a temporary wife. See, the pronouns shifted in the conversation so gradually that she almost didn't notice. And when she did notice, he'd said, "We need the storage on your side. See, it'll be closer to the stove," and the word "your" had meant something different than it would have meant in December. She filed it quietly and let it stay. See, she had stopped being someone visiting his life. She was in it. See, and that was a different thing. The first week of April was mild enough to start working on the North Edition. See, Ronan had done enough preparation through the winter ordering materials in his mind, staging the lumber he'd cut from fallen timber on the east side, that the framing went up in 3 days of sustained, see, physical work that left both of them tired in a clean and satisfying way. See, she helped where she could, and where she couldn't, she was useful in other ways, keeping water and food available, managing the interior work that the expansion made necessary. See, making decisions about the reconfigured space that he asked her about and genuinely incorporated rather than simply acknowledging. See, that second part was new, or newly visible. "Where do you want the second shelf unit?" he asked on the 3rd day, head and shoulders inside the new wall frame. See, left of the window, she said. "You want light when you're reading the inventory." See, he moved the framing mark 6 inches to the left. She went back to what she was doing. See, but she carried that small moment with her through the rest of the afternoon. Because there was a whole world in a question, like, where do you want the shelf? The assumption that her preference was load-bearing information. See, that the answer mattered not because she was temporary and needed accommodation, but because this was her home and she knew it best, at least in this particular way. See, it was not a dramatic realization. It was more like recognizing something that had been true for a while. See, she had stopped waiting to see if she was staying. See, she was already here. The letter from Red Hollow arrived in the 2nd week of April, brought up by a supply rider who made the run now that the pass was clear. See, it was from a lawyer she'd never heard of, writing on behalf of a creditor she had heard of, one of Thomas's, the last one she still owed. See, a man named Garrett, who had been patient in a specifically ominous way that told her he'd been biding his time rather than letting go. See, the letter said, in language that cost a lot to make sound reasonable, that the outstanding debt of $212 would need to be resolved before summer. See, at which point the creditor intended to pursue the matter through the county court. See, she read it twice at the table. Then she sat with it for a while. See, she could pay it. The $500 was hers. Ronan had made that clear, had made it clear twice, and she believed him. See, $212 left her with almost $300, which was not nothing, which was in fact more than she'd had at any point in her adult life, except the first months of marriage when Thomas's optimism had briefly been funded. See, she could pay it and not tell Ronan. It was her debt. See, it had nothing to do with him. She told him that evening. See, not because she needed to, but because she'd said in February that she wasn't going to let him manage things alone, and fairness meant she couldn't hold herself to a different standard. See, he read the letter. Said, 212. See, I can pay it out of the 500, she said. You don't need to do that, he said. See, Ronan's a joint debt, he said. Marriage means joint debts. See, she looked at him. That's not what you said in December, she said. See, in December, I said a lot of things that were useful at the time, he said. See, he pushed the letter back toward her. Pay it out of what we have. See, not out of your 500. What we have, she repeated. See, we have savings, he said, with the specific matter-of-factness of a man for whom this was obvious. See, I've been banking the trap income for 3 years. See, we pay Garrett, and we're done with Thomas Whitlock's business. See, she sat with that for a moment. Done with Thomas Whitlock's business. See, there was something freeing in it that she hadn't expected, not because she'd been waiting for someone to rescue her from Thomas's debts. She'd been managing them herself. She would have managed this too. See, but the word we had a weight to it that we usually don't get when you're alone. See, she paid Garrett with the shared account Ronan described, through a bank in Red Hollow that she'd write to that week. And the letter she sent in return was short and final in the way only a paid debt can be. See, and when she sealed it, she felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years. See, like she was standing on flat ground. The boundary survey arrived 3 weeks later. See, Vale had moved faster than she'd expected, faster, probably than the Western Meridian Railway had expected too, which was likely the point. See, the independent surveyor was a man named Hobart, 60-something, methodical and unimpressed by anyone. See, and he arrived with his equipment and his assistant and spent 4 days walking every inch of the property line without any apparent concern for the railway's feelings about the process. See, Vane came too. Of course Vane came. He arrived on the second day of the survey looking like a man who has not slept enough and has decided to make that someone else's problem. See, he didn't come inside. He stood at the edge of the property and watched Hobart work with the expression of a man watching money leave. See, Mara brought water out to Hobart and his assistant on the second afternoon, because it was the courteous thing to do, see, and Hobart accepted it with a brief nod and a look that told her he'd done this long enough to have no opinion about either side of a property dispute beyond the accuracy of the measurements. See, Vane intercepted her on the way back. Mrs. Mercer, he said, placing himself in her path in a way that was technically incidental and wasn't. See, she stopped, looked at him. He had a different energy than he'd had in April. See, less aggressive, more calculating the shift of a man who's tried the direct approach and is considering the adjacent one. See, you're invested in the survey outcome, he said. I'm invested in accuracy, she said. See, of course. He paused. It occurs to me that your position here is dependent on the outcome of several legal processes. See, the homestead claim, now the boundary survey. If either of those, see, Mr. Vane, she said, I want to make sure I understand what you're doing right now. See, he looked at her. You're suggesting, she said, that I should be uncertain enough about my future here to make it worth my while to cooperate with whatever you're proposing. See, is that close? A pause. I'm simply noting I've been noted at by men like you for most of my adult life, she said, and she kept her voice level because she'd learned that level was more effective than loud. See, they had more money than me and better lawyers and the advantage of numbers, and I still ended up in a better position than they wanted me in. She looked at him. See, whatever you're about to offer me, the answer is no. See, whatever angle you're about to try, I've probably seen a version of it. See, and whatever you think my position here is, you're miscounting what I have. See, he looked at her with the eyes of a man recalculating again. See, what do you have, he said. She looked back at him. See, more than you think, she said, and walked past him into the cabin. See, she didn't tell Ronan about that conversation until that evening, and when she did, she told it straight, no editing, no softening. See, he sat with it. What did he offer? Ronan said. He didn't get that far, she said. See, what do you think he was going to offer? Money, probably. See, or a threat dressed as an offer. She paused. Something to make me feel like my position depended on his goodwill. See, Ronan looked at the table. And you don't feel that way, he said. See, your position doesn't feel dependent. It was not quite a question. See, no, she said, it doesn't. He looked up at her. See, good, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Ronan, she said. See, is there something you're asking me without asking me? See, he was quiet for a beat. I want to know, he said carefully, that you're here because you want to be here, and not because you don't know what your options are. See, she understood this immediately and completely, because it was the same thing she'd asked herself when she made the decision in April, and she'd asked it clearly and gotten a clear answer, and he deserved to hear that answer. See, I know what my options are, she said. I have $500 and the ability to work, and I've survived worse starts than this. See, if I left tomorrow, I'd be uncomfortable for a while, and then I'd be fine. She looked at him steadily. See, I'm not here because I can't leave. I'm here because leaving would be the wrong choice, and I know the difference. See, he looked at her. All right, she said. See, he went back to whatever he'd been working on, and she did the same, and the fire settled and the mountain was quiet outside, and she thought about what it meant to choose a thing clearly, not out of fear or necessity or the narrowing of options. See, but out of the specific conviction that this here was worth choosing. See, she had chosen badly before. She knew that. Thomas had not been a malicious man, but he'd been a careless one, and she'd stayed past the point where staying made sense because leaving felt like failure, and she'd confused endurance with loyalty. See, she was not enduring this. She was choosing it. The distinction mattered enormously. See, it was in fact the whole thing. See, Hobart's survey was completed on the 4th day, and the results were what she and Ronan had known. They would be from the beginning. The original boundary, from 1871, was exactly where Ronan's father's survey had placed it. See, the railway's stakes were positioned illegally inside the Mercer property line, and the Western Meridian Railway Company had no defensible claim to a single acre of the East Quarter. See, Hobart delivered the report to Vail, who forwarded it to the county court within the week, and the railway's lawyers filed the expected challenge. And the county court assigned a date for a hearing that was 4 months out, see, which was how these things went slowly, through channels, in a language that cost money to translate. See, Vane left the mountain. She watched him go from the cabin doorway and felt a specific quiet satisfaction that she didn't perform for anyone, just held privately in the way you hold things that don't need to be shared to be real. See, the summer arrived the way summers do at altitude, not gradually but all at once, as though the mountain had been saving it up. See, the snow retreated to the high places, and the lower slopes greened in a way that she'd imagined but hadn't fully prepared for, vivid and vigorous. See, the color of a place that had been suppressed for months and was now making an aggressive case for itself. See, she had been making mental notes all winter, and she started executing them in May. See, a kitchen garden on the south-facing slope modest, nothing ambitious, but enough to supplement significantly by late summer. See, better organization of the storage structure. See, a proper path to the spring which Ronan had been meaning to improve for 3 years, and which she pushed to the front of the list, because she was the one who went to the spring most often, and the current path was appalling. See, he improved the path without complaint, which was its own kind of statement about how things had changed. See, They worked alongside each other through the early summer in a manner that didn't particularly resemble what either of them had grown up understanding as a partnership. See, it wasn't traditional in the way of the territory. She didn't stay in the cabin while he worked outside, and he didn't stay outside while she kept house. See, the division was more functional than categorical. See, she did the things she was better at. He did the things he was better at. They did the overlapping things together, which was a larger category than she'd expected. See, what she was better at turned out to include more than she'd brought to the original transaction. See, she was better at planning ahead, not just food and supply management, but the longer arc, the seasonal thinking, the anticipation of what would be needed when. See, she was better at communication, which had became relevant when a neighboring settler named Aldous Crew showed up in June to discuss a water rights question that affected both properties. See, and she sat at the table for that conversation and helped navigate it to an outcome that neither party left angry about. See, Ronan watched her in that conversation with the particular quality of attention she'd noticed all winter, the one that wasn't assessment anymore. See, she knew what it was now. It was the attention of a man who finds the person he's looking at genuinely interesting, and she'd learned to recognize it without getting flustered by it, mostly. See, Aldous Crew was a good-natured man in his 50s who'd been in the Blackstone Range for 2 years with his wife, Hetty, and 2 grown sons who'd come out to help establish the property. See, he became, over the summer, the closest thing to a neighbor they had, and Hetty Crew, who was practical and funny and had strong opinions about everyone and everything, became the first woman Mara had talked to since December. See, the first time Hetty came to visit July, a clear afternoon, uninvited in the specific way of someone who's decided you're going to be friends and is simply beginning that process, she looked around the cabin with the frank, assessing eyes of a woman who knows what a house tells you about the people in it. See, you did all this? She asked, meaning the organization, the garden visible through the window, the addition on the north side now fully finished. See, we did, Mara said. Hetty looked at her with a slight smile. See, you're not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? See, Aldous said Mercer had gotten himself a wife for the winter, she said. See, he made it sound like something temporary. Mara handed her a cup of coffee. See, it was temporary, she said. And then it wasn't. See, Hetty looked at her for a moment. Good, she said simply, and drank her coffee, and they talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing. See, and when Hetty left, she took 2 jars of preserved berries that Mara had put up from the first harvest, and left a loaf of bread that was better than anything Mara had managed to produce in a camp oven, and the trade seemed correct. See, Ronan came back from the trap lines to find the bread on the table. See, Hetty Crew, Mara said before he asked. He picked it up. See, examined it. Better than yours, he said. I know, she said. See, she uses a different starter. I'm going to learn it. See, he set the bread down. He had a look on his face that she couldn't immediately categorize, and she turned to look at him more directly. See, what, she said. Nothing, he said. He stopped. See, did the hand motion. It doesn't feel like nothing anymore. See, up here. She understood what he meant. It had felt like nothing for 7 years, isolated by design, managed by discipline, alive but not particularly connected to being alive. See, and now it felt like something. And the difference was not just her. She knew that. It was the accumulation of small things that happen when a person stops deciding in advance that connection isn't worth the exposure. See, no, she agreed, it doesn't. See, he sat down at the table and cut the bread and handed her the larger piece, which he did now without either of them commenting on it, and they ate in the evening quiet that was different from the winter quiet, warmer, looser, see, with the sounds of the mountain in its working season coming through the new window. See, the county court hearing on the boundary dispute was held in Red Hollow in August. See, they went together. She had not been in Red Hollow since December, and the town looked different to her, smaller than she remembered, more makeshift, the particular impermanence of a place that was still deciding whether it was going to last. See, she'd lived here for 3 years and hadn't thought much about it, and now she walked through it next to Ronan and saw it through the eyes of someone who had been somewhere more permanent and was passing through. See, Dottie Crail's boarding house was still on Crane Street. See, She walked past it on the way to the courthouse and noted, without particular emotion, that the back hallway window was the same smudged glass she'd looked through 100 times while she was on her knees. See, she did not feel nostalgia. She felt the specific, clean distance of a person who has moved far enough from a place to see it accurately. See, Ronan noticed she'd slowed. That the boarding house? He said. See. Yes, he looked at it. You were scrubbing floors, he said. See. Yes. When I walked in, he said, you didn't stand up right away. She glanced at him. I was finishing the section. See, I know, he said. That's when I knew. She looked at him. See. Knew what? She said. That you were the right person, he said. See. Anyone else would have stood up the moment a stranger walked in. See. You finished what you were doing. She looked at him for a moment. See. That's a very specific thing to have decided that quickly, she said. See. I'm very specific, he said, and kept walking, and she followed, and she was glad she was a step behind him, because whatever was happening on her face in that moment was her own business. See. The courthouse hearing was not dramatic in the way that mattered, it was legal, which meant it was slow and technical, and required patience of the variety that is mostly just sitting very still while other people talk. See, Ronan and Mara sat on one side of the room with their documents and Hobart's survey report. See, the railway's lawyers sat on the other side with considerably more paper and considerably more confidence, the specific confidence of men who believe that volume of paperwork is a form of argument. See, the judge was not Vale. See, he was a younger man named Price, and she assessed him in the first 10 minutes as someone who was still forming his relationship with the railway's money, not yet fully decided, which was both better and worse than already decided. See, Vane was there. See, he sat behind his lawyers in a suit that cost more than the cabin's supply budget for the year, and he watched the proceedings with the particular attention of a man who has prepared for many contingencies and is tracking which one he's in. See, she watched him while the lawyers talked. She thought about what he'd said on the mountain. That first day, your position is dependent on outcomes. See, he'd been right about that, technically. Her position was dependent on outcomes. See, most people's positions were, if you looked at it plainly, the ground you stand on is always somebody's decision. See, the difference was whose. When Ronan's turn came to present the boundary evidence, he stood up and was himself flat, direct, no performance. See, every word carrying the specific weight of a man who is not trying to persuade you, but simply showing you what's true and expecting you to see it. See, he had a quality in front of that judge that she suspected most people missed because it didn't look like anything dramatic. See, but she saw it, complete certainty, not arrogance. See, the specific, unshakable certainty of a person who has been right about their ground for 20 years and has the survey from 1,871 to prove it. See, she spoke once, briefly, about the stake movements she'd witnessed firsthand during the winter. See, the dates, the measurements, the direction of displacement. See, she spoke the way she'd learned to speak in rooms like this, from years of sitting next to Thomas, while lawyers talked with the organized calm of someone who knows exactly what they're saying and why. See, Judge Price looked at her with a slightly surprised expression. See, Vane's lawyer objected, technically, to the relevance of her testimony. See, Price overruled it without particular heat and asked her to continue. See, she continued. The railway's lawyers presented their counter-survey, a document produced in the last 3 weeks by their own surveyor who had found, conveniently, that the boundary was exactly where the railway wanted it to be. See, Price looked at both surveys. He looked at Hobart's report. See, he asked 3 questions of the railway's surveyor and got 3 answers that, Mara noted, were increasingly careful in the way answers get when they're built on something that doesn't hold. See, Price called a recess. She and Ronan sat in the hallway on a bench that was slightly too narrow and slightly too hard and said very little. See, at some point he put his hand over hers where it rested on her knee, and she turned her hand over and let his fingers close around it. See, and they sat like that in the hallway of the Red Hollow courthouse in August with the sounds of the town coming through the windows. See, and she thought about December and the distance between who she'd been in that boarding house hallway and who she was now, which was the same person, but with different ground under her feet. See, The recess lasted 45 minutes. Price came back and delivered his finding in the particular compressed language of legal decisions. The Mercer boundary, as established in the 1871 survey, was legally binding. See, the railway's counter-survey was insufficient to establish a competing claim. The survey stakes placed within the Mercer boundary were unauthorized encroachment. See, the Western Meridian Railway Company was to remove those stakes and any related equipment within 30 days. See, the railway's lawyers were already consulting in a huddle before Price had finished the last sentence. See, Vane looked at Ronan across the room. Ronan looked back. See, that exchange lasted maybe 3 seconds and contained no words, and she was close enough to see both faces. See, Vane's was the face of a man recalculating on a loss. See, Ronan's was the face of a man who has been right about something for a long time and is not particularly surprised to be confirmed, but is satisfied in the specific, quiet way of a person who has had to wait a long time for satisfaction. See, then Ronan looked at her instead. See, and what was on his face when he looked at her was different from what had been there when he looked at Vane. And she did not have a label for it that was precise enough, but it had in it something of the morning after the fever broke. See, and the lantern on the table, and the hand she'd covered with hers in March, and the moment in April when he'd said, "I want you here," and she'd said, "I'm choosing to stay." See, all of those things compressed into a single look. See, done, she said. See, they walked out of the Red Hollow courthouse into the August heat, which was significant even at this elevation, and Ronan stood on the courthouse steps in a way that she recognized as him not quite knowing what to do with a win. See, he was better calibrated for endurance than for victory. She'd learned the struggle was familiar territory, the resolution slightly disorienting. See, she took his arm, not his hand, this time. His arm, the full proprietary warmth of it, and she felt him adjust to accommodate her the way he'd started adjusting to accommodate her presence in the spring, not perfectly, not immediately, but genuinely. "See, lunch," she said, "before we head back." "At Dottie's?" he said. See, she considered. "No," she said. "Somewhere with a window." See, they found a place with a window. They ate lunch in the specific, comfortable quiet of two people who have said the important things and know they can say more later. And they watched Red Hollow go about its business outside the glass. See, and she thought about creditor Hollis and his hat and the way he'd walked out like she was furniture, and how long ago that felt, and how accurately the feeling of being furniture had predicted how wrong things were about to get for her. See, she was not furniture. She had never been furniture. See, she'd spent a long time in circumstances that treated her like she was, and she'd survived them the way she has survived everything, by being more stubborn than the circumstances. And eventually the circumstances had changed, and she was here. See, she was here. "I want to tell you something," she said. See, he looked up from his food. "When you walked into the boarding house in December," she said, "I calculated about 12 different reasons not to go with you." See, the isolation, the uncertainty, the fact that I didn't know you and didn't know if you were trustworthy and didn't have any leverage if you weren't. See, those were reasonable calculations, he said. "They were," she said. See, and then I shook your hand anyway. She paused. "I've been thinking about why." See, he waited. "I think it wasn't the money," she said. See, or not only the money, I think it was that you told me the truth going in. See, every other person I'd been dealing with for 2 years, the creditors, the lawyers, Thomas's business partners, they all talked around what they actually wanted. See, you walked in and said exactly what you needed and exactly what you were offering and didn't pretend it was anything else. She looked at him. See, I think I'd been starving for that. Just the plain truth of what something was. See, he looked at her across the table. "I wasn't particularly honest with myself," he said. See, about what I needed. "No," she agreed. "But you were honest with me, which was what I needed from you." She paused. "See, we figured out the rest later." He was quiet for a moment. "See, we did," he said. She picked up her coffee. "I'm going to write to my mother's sister in Ohio," she said. "See, I haven't corresponded with her in 2 years. I'd like to tell her where I am." See, he nodded. "You have paper," he said, "at the cabin." See, "I know I have paper at the cabin, Ronan." "I know you know," he said. See, "I was trying to say." He stopped, made the hand motion. "See, I was saying it's there if you want it." That's all. See, she looked at him. You were saying it's home, she said. See, and you should say that because that's what you mean. See, he met her eyes. Yes, she said. See, it is. They rode back up in the afternoon light, which came at the particular angle it only comes at in late summer, low and warm, and making everything it touched look more substantial than it was. See, the track had improved since December. She'd had a hand in that, had lobbied Ronan in April to spend a week on it. See, arguing that a better track meant better supply access, and wasn't that worth the time? And the horses moved steadily, and she sat beside him on the wagon seat and watched the mountains come up around them and felt, see, the specific gravity of going somewhere you belong. See, she had not felt this since her mother's house. See, she had thought, after her mother died, that it was a feeling you only got once, that particular sense of a place that was yours, not because of a deed or a payment, but because your bones knew the dimensions of it. See, she'd spent 8 years after that in houses that were just structures. See, Thomas's house, the boarding house. A room before that in a town she'd left at 24, trying to get somewhere better. See, she had apparently been wrong about the once. The cabin came into view around the last bend in the track, the way it always did, the stone chimney first, then the roof, then the full shape of it sitting against the tree line. See, and now the north addition beside it with its new window catching the afternoon light. See, the kitchen garden on the south slope, the improved path to the spring. See, the storage structure in the right position, 12 feet from the door, not 20. See, the garden needed water. She'd been gone 2 days. See, she climbed down from the wagon before it had fully stopped, which Ronan said nothing about because he'd learned to say nothing about it, and she went to the garden with the bucket. See, and she watered it in the long August light while he unhitched the horses, and neither of them talked, and neither of them needed to. See, later, after the animals were settled, and the garden was done, and the cabin was warm from the stove she'd restarted, she sat down at the table to write the letter to her mother's sister. See, she'd been composing it in her head for days, the way you compose things when you're not sure where to start. See, the news was too large for a short letter and too complicated for a long one, and she'd been circling it. See, she started writing. She told her aunt that she was in the Blackstone Range. See, that she had remarried. She used that word deliberately. Remarried, see, because it was accurate, and because she was done being careful about accuracy, to a man named Ronan Mercer, who owned land here and was a difficult man in some ways and a good man in more ways, and who she had come to understand was the specific type, see, of person who was much easier to overlook than to see, which was a shame because what you saw when you looked was considerable. See, she told her aunt that she was, for the first time in a long time, not managing a situation. See, she was in one. The difference had taken her some months to understand fully, but she understood it now. See, she told her about the garden. She told her about Hetty Crew. See, she told her about the book on the workbench with 2 sets of fingerprints. See, she stopped before she told her about the winter, because the winter was too long for a letter. See, she would tell her in person. That thought arrived without announcement in person. See, she would have her aunt to visit, or they would go east, some winter, when the mountain allowed it. See, the world was not as inaccessible as she'd been treating it for 2 years, and the isolation of this place was real but not total, and she was done treating her own life like something to be survived rather than inhabited. See, Ronan came and looked over her shoulder at the letter, briefly, without reading it, just noting that she was writing. See, almost done, he said. Almost, she said. He went to put more wood on the fire. See, she finished the letter and folded it and addressed it, and then she sat at the table and looked at the cabin, her side of it, his side of it, see, the place where the line used to be on the floor, and thought about the particular mathematics of 2 people choosing each other. See, it was not simple math. It was the kind that required recalculation at intervals, that was thrown off by variables you didn't anticipate and had to be corrected for in real time. See, there was nothing in it that guaranteed the answer stayed the same. See, but you did the calculation honestly. See, and you showed your work. See, and you corrected when you were wrong. See, and you kept going. See, that was all it ever was. She had gone through a winter on a mountain with a man who had handed her a rule book on the first day and watched every single rule in it stop applying. See, and neither of them had been able to make the rules stick, because the rules were built on the premise that they were strangers, and they had stopped being strangers somewhere around the second week. See, and by the blizzard, it was already too late for rules. See, she thought about the line on the floor. She thought about how Ronan had drawn it with such conviction, such architectural certainty. This is my side. This is yours. See, this is the boundary, and how it had faded out of the wood inside of 2 weeks, because wood changes under lived-in weight and cold and heat and the ordinary pressure of two people in the same space. See, you could not draw a line in something that was going to keep being lived in. See, she should have known that then. She knew it now. See, he was across the room, her impossible, specific, difficult man sitting by the fire with the Roman history book that she'd read twice and he'd read 4 times, reading it again as though it might tell him something new. See, which it probably would, because that was the kind of reader he was, and the light was doing what it did to the angles of his face. And she thought, this is my life. See, not the life she'd planned, not the life she'd endured. See, the one she'd found at the bottom of a very difficult winter and held onto with both hands. See, it needed work. He needed work. She knew that. He would still go quiet when something mattered too much, would still reach for distance when closeness got specific. See, would still stand at the window looking at the mountain ridge when what he actually meant was that he was afraid of losing something and didn't have a language for fear that wasn't motion. See, she would still get angry before she got sad, still hold things longer than was useful before she said them, still occasionally mistake endurance for wisdom and need to be corrected on that. See, they would figure it out. See, they had been figuring things out together since February with the particular imperfect, incremental stubbornness of two people who had been alone too long and were too old for the pretense that it was a preference rather than an adaptation. See, outside, the last light was leaving the mountain. The second winter was 3 months away, and she thought about it without dread for the first time. See, she thought about the stove and the coffee saved in the south crate and the book with the fingerprints and the way he said her name when it was 3 a.m. and the world was only firelight. See, she thought, I know how to keep the stove burning in a hard wind. See, I know the trick with the damper. I know which wood burns longest and which burns hottest. And I know that the cold up here is serious, but it doesn't last forever. And the people who make it through are not the ones who don't feel it. See, they're the ones who feel it and build the fire anyway. See, she knew how to do that. She had always known how to do that. See, she just hadn't had anywhere worth doing it. Ronan looked up from his book and found her watching him, which had now become a thing they did, without embarrassment catching each other, looking and not looking away. See, letters done, he said. Yes, she said, good. He went back to his book. See, then, without looking up, I was thinking we should add a second animal shelter before October. See, Aldous Crew wants to winter some of his stock up here, and we could use the income. See, she looked at him. You want to expand, she said. See, we could use it, he said. You've been planning this, she said. See, thinking about it, he said, which with Ronan meant the same thing. See, she looked at the north addition, looked at the window he'd built where she'd said to build it. See, looked at the man reading his history book about empires that had lasted centuries and fallen, and whether any of them would say, at the end, that the falling was the whole story, or just the most recent chapter. See, show me what you're thinking, she said. He looked up. See, something in his face settled the specific ease of a man who has asked for something and been met. See, he got up and went for the drawings. She moved the coffee cups to make room. See, outside, the Blackstone Range held its silence, the way it always had, vast and permanent and entirely indifferent to the small particular lives being lived within it. See, the mountain did not care about the Western Meridian Railway. See, it did not care about contracts or magistrates or lines drawn on floors. See, it had been here before any of that and would be here long after. See, but inside the cabin, on a table cleared of coffee cups, in the light of a stove, tended by someone who had learned the trick of it, a man and a woman bent over drawings of something they were building together. See, and that ordinary, specific, improbable thing was enough. See, it was more than enough. It was in fact everything.